He fell asleep at the wheel after his third night shift. He woke up in a cart, shackled in rusty chains, surrounded by dozens of strangers being taken to their deaths at the edge of the dark forest. And on his wrist, a brand was seared into the bone with a red-hot nail. A mark that means nothing in this world. Farmer Rank F. Park So Jin opens his eyes in a swaying cart beneath a low gray sky. It smells of wet straw and strangers' sweat. His hands won't move. He glances down and sees a glowing rune on his wrist. Angular, foreign. He doesn't know this language, but he understands its meaning in his gut. Farmer, rank F. No application. Fragments flash through his mind. The steering wheel of a truck. The smell of seedlings on pallets. The white light of an oncoming truck's headlights. And darkness. He was driving from the facility near Faju, fell asleep at the wheel. And now he lies crammed together with dozens of bodies on the wooden planks of a cart. Women are clutching their children. Old people are staring into space. Someone whimpers. Someone whispers a prayer. The escort stands up abruptly. A soldier in a breastplate strikes the side of the wagon with the shaft of his spear and shouts that the exiles have arrived. That decree number 414 has been carried out. That the crown wishes them a swift death and a pure rebirth. Soldiers walk along the wagons and break the shackles with a chisel. They don't remove them, they break them. So Jin jumps down and sinks ankle-deep into black mud. A forest rises before him. Only that word doesn't fit. The trees are black, not dark, black. The trunks gleam like wet coal. The branches stick out at odd angles. Between them hangs a fog that smells of rot and iron, as if a huge metal carcass were decomposing deep within. One exile rushes toward the officer and grabs his stirrup. He begs. He has a daughter. She won't survive the night. The officer looks down on him and mutters that in Garam, everyone is equal. That his daughter is now free of her obligations to the crown. Then he kicks him in the face and spurs his horse. The convoy trots away. The dust settles. 112 people remain at the edge of the black forest. The silence lasts 3 heartbeats. Then someone screams. A woman falls to her knees and howls into the fete. The man hurls a stone after the convoy. The old man sits down in the mud and covers his face with his hands. Panic spreads like water from an overturned bucket. So Jin doesn't scream. He crouches down and sniffs the earth. He rubs a black lump between his fingers. He puts a crumb on his tongue. He spits it out. Sour. Very sour. Acidity around 5.3. Excess nitrogen. Almost no phosphorus. Zero drainage. Water sits in the top layer and doesn't drain away. The roots are rotting. And this is where the strangest part begins. This isn't cursed land. It's dead soil with a dead structure and zero drainage. He saw this in his sophomore year. He saw it during an internship in Choila Namdo, where the rice paddies looked exactly the same after a flood. The smell, the texture, the color, everything matches. Nearby, a man with a battered face is yelling that they'll be dead by nightfall, that monsters will emerge from the fog and devour them. So Jin stands up. He brushes off his palms. He says calmly that no one will die, that he needs 10 people who know how to dig straight ditches. The rest should gather dry brushwood, only dry. 3 hours until dark. They'll make it. The screamer cackles, asks who he even is. So Jin raises his wrist and shows the rune. Farmer, rank F. The crowd laughs, angry, nervous. So Jin doesn't argue. He scans the crowd for those who aren't laughing. A thin woman with 2 children, an old man with the hands of a digger, a guy with a broken nose. He approaches the old man and asks if he knows how to dig. The old man stares at him for a long time, nods. So Jin draws a line, from here to there, knee-deep, straight as an arrow. The old man asks why. So Jin replies that the water must drain away. Once the water drains, the earth will begin to breathe. Once the earth begins to breathe, a fence will rise that will stand until morning. The fence will stand, and so will they. The old man gets up and says he needs a shovel. There are no shovels. There are flat stones, sticks, hands. So Jin grabs a sharp stone and digs into the ground first, in silence. 10 minutes later, the old man is digging beside him. 20 minutes later, the guy with the broken nose. An hour later, 9 people are digging the trench. So Jin doesn't count. He digs. His hands burn. His back aches. This body is weaker than before, thinner, hungrier, but it obeys, and the earth yields. He feels it not only with his hands. The soil seems to speak to him through touch. It whispers where the water is closer, where there's a rock beneath the surface, where the clay is denser. He doesn't understand how it works, but he trusts his hands. By sunset, the ditch is ready, crooked, shallow, but the water flows. Black, stinking sludge flows away from the spot where So Jin drives the first fence post into the ground, and in that moment, the earth beneath him sighs. Something ancient and heavy stirs deep below and turns to face him. The system responds to his touch. It registers the work. It says without words that this patch of earth is now his, that as long as he stands on it with his feet, not a single creature from the mist will cross the line of the ditch. So Jin sits right down in the mud. 9 people stand around him, wet, dirty. They look at him and wait. In his past life, he managed a shift of 6 technicians at a hydroponic farm, and the hardest part was when someone forgot to turn off the pump. And now, 112 people stand at the edge of a forest that has been devouring everyone for 200 years. And all he can give them is a ditch. He smiles. He stands up. He tells the 9 of them that tomorrow they'll dig another one. The day after tomorrow, another. Then he'll find seeds, and they'll plant their first garden bed. And if he knows anything about soil, this black muck will yield such a harvest that they'll forget the word hunger. The old man asks where such confidence comes from. So Jin answers simply. It's his job. He studied it for 8 years. And if this world has decided that his class is useless, then this world simply doesn't know what an agronomist is. Night falls on Garam like a coffin lid. The fog thickens. Sounds creep out of the forest. A screech, a crunch. Something heavy is dragging itself between the trees. Children are crying. Adults huddle around the campfires. So Jin sits at the edge of the ditch and listens to the earth. The earth tells him that something is standing on the other side. Something big. Something hungry. It's approaching the very edge. It freezes and doesn't cross over. His heart is pounding so loudly, he's afraid the creature will hear it. But the line holds. The earth he dug up with his hands won't let it go any further. The creature stands there for a minute, turns around. It goes back into the fog. So Jin exhales. His hands are shaking. He sits like that until dawn without closing his eyes. Morning comes gray and cold. The fog recedes but doesn't go away. So Jin stands on his stiff legs and walks from campfire to campfire. He asks for seeds, any kind, grain, beans, anything, patiently, without pressure. One shakes his head, another spits, a third remains silent. On the 23rd person, he gets lucky. A frail old man with trembling hands and a weaver's robe reaches into his bosom and pulls out a rag bundle. Inside is a handful of barley, a few beans, pumpkin seeds. The old man says he was a monastery gardener before his sentence, that he slipped the seeds into his pocket at the trial without knowing why. His hand just reached out. So Jin takes the bundle as carefully as if it were a child. He sniffs it. The seeds are dry, alive. He looks at the old man and says that he has just saved 112 lives. The old man blinks and cries, quietly, silently. So Jin knelt in the black earth and examined the barley seeds in the palm of his hand. 12 grains. He counted them 3 times. 12 grains of barley, 9 beans, 4 pumpkin seeds. That was all they had. In his past life, a single experimental plot in the lab required 2 kilograms of seed. And here, 12 grains for 112 mouths. He closed his eyes and began to count. Early maturing barley, under ideal conditions, yields a harvest in 45 days. A single ear yields 20 to 40 grains. If all 12 survive and yield 30 grains each, then in a month and a half, he'll have 360 grains. After 2 cycles, nearly 13,000. After 3 cycles, you could sow a real field. But that's under ideal conditions, and the conditions were far from ideal. The old gardener stood nearby and watched. His name was Moon Gil, 63 years old, a weaver's rune on his wrist. He had worked in the monastery garden for 30 years. Convicted of stealing 3 sacks of wheat, he hadn't stolen them. He had distributed them to the starving village next to the monastery. The abbot had written a denunciation. The trial lasted 4 minutes. Moon Gil told this without complaint, just a fact, like the temperature. So Jin listened and dug, a second ditch, parallel to the first. He marked out the lines with a stick, jabbing it into the ground every 2 steps. Moon Gil asked why a second ditch, so Jin explained. 1 ditch drains the water. 2 ditches create a raised bed between them. The water drains to the sides, the middle dries out, the roots get air, the soil starts to work. Moon Gil nodded. Then he asked where So Jin knew all this from. So Jin replied that he had studied for a long time. Moon Gil shook his head and said that in 30 years in the garden he hadn't heard anything like that the monks watered and prayed, and that usually that was enough. By noon on the second day, they had 3 ditches, straight, deep. Between them, 2 ridges of loose soil, each 20 meters long. So Jin had chosen the spot wisely, not on flat ground, slightly on a slope, so the water would flow down the ditches toward the lowlands on its own. He explained this to the 3 men digging nearby, and they looked at him as if he were a sorcerer. To them, water flowed wherever God sent it. The idea that you could make water flow where you needed it was something out of the realm of magic. So Jin didn't argue. He just dug, and the men dug with him. There were more of them now. Not 9, 17. Those who had laughed yesterday now stood silently to the side and watched. Those who had been crying began to approach and ask how they could help. So Jin gave everyone a task, a simple one, specific. You gather stones this size. You break dry branches as long as your arm. You carry water from the stream in any container you can find. People obeyed, not because they believed, because he was the only one telling them what to do. When there's chaos all around, any voice with a plan becomes an anchor. That evening, So Jin planted the first seed. He dug a hole with his finger, 1 knuckle deep. He placed the seed, covered it with soil, pressed down with his palm, and he felt something respond. The earth beneath his hand grew warmer, by a fraction of a degree, maybe 2. He wouldn't have noticed it before, but now his fingers felt everything, every grain of sand, every root of dead grass, every pebble. The system had responded, quietly, like a distant rumble. It told him the seed had been accepted, that the earth was marked, that this was his field. So Jin planted the remaining 11 barley grains, spacing them a palm's width apart, then the beans, then the pumpkin seeds separately at the edge of the bed. Moon Gil watched his hands and said nothing. When So Jin finished, the old man quietly said that in 30 years in the garden, he had seen how monks planted, and how peasants, and how nobles planted for fun. But he had never seen a man plant like this. So Jin asked exactly how. Moon Gil answered with a single word. Exactly. Night brought the creatures back. This time, there were more of them. So Jin could hear it through the ground. It was vibrating, faintly, as if someone were beating a drum far beneath the surface. He sat at the edge of the garden bed and counted the vibrations. 3, 5, 7. At least 7 creatures were prowling around the camp. They approached the trenches, stopped, and left. But one of them didn't leave. So Jin sensed it. The creature was standing on the north side, where the trench was shallower, where he hadn't had time to dig all the way through. It stood there and tried. It placed a paw on the edge, pulled back, placed it again. The line held, but thinner, weaker. So Jin stood up. He walked over to that spot. In the fog, he could see only an outline. Large, twice his height, 4 legs, or 6, he couldn't tell. The creature turned what was its head toward him. So Jin picked up a rock and began to dig. Right here, right now, in the darkness, with his hands and the rock. He deepened the trench, 20 centimeters, 30, 40. The earth was wet and heavy. His fingers slipped. He broke a nail on the index finger of his right hand and didn't notice. He dug. The creature stood 3 meters away and watched. Then the earth beneath his hands sighed again. The trench deepened. The line solidified. The creature retreated. Slowly, reluctantly, like a dog chased from the doorstep. It vanished into the fog. So Jin sat down in the mud. He looked at his hands. His index finger was covered in blood. A torn-off fingernail dangled from a flap of skin. He tore it off with his teeth, spit, wrapped a strip of fabric from his sleeve around his finger. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. He wasn't a hero. He was an agronomist. He'd spent 8 years in an office and on a farm. The most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him was when a shelf of pots had toppled over in the warehouse. And now he was digging a trench in front of the creature from the fog so it wouldn't devour the sleeping children. He pressed his hands to his face, and like that, until he stopped shaking. Then he stood up and went to check the other areas. On the morning of the 3rd day, the first bad thing happened. An 8-year-old girl, the daughter of one of the exiled women. The fever started at night. By morning, the child was burning up. Her skin was red. Her eyes were glassy. Her mother held her close and rocked back and forth. So Jin approached. He touched the girl's forehead. Hot, very hot. Dehydration, exhaustion, infection. No medicine, no clean water, no shelter from the night's cold. He clenched his teeth. He stepped back. He looked at the forest. He remembered. In his sophomore year, Professor Park taught an elective on ethnobotany. He talked about plants that were considered poisonous in some cultures, but used as medicine in others. It wasn't about the plant itself, but how it was processed. So Jin turned to Moon Gil. He asked if there was a plant in this forest that the locals called poisonous, a stinging, bitter, with gray-green leaves. Moon Gil turned pale. He said there was, widow's nettle, that it kills in 2 hours, that you can't even touch it. So Jin nodded and said he needed a lot of that grass. Moon Gil grabbed his sleeve and said he was crazy, so Jin didn't bother to explain. He walked off into the fog alone. The camp behind him fell silent. Someone shouted that he wouldn't come back. Someone said there was one less fool. So Jin walked through the forest and listened to the earth. It guided him. It showed him where the roots were healthy and where they were diseased, where the soil was dead and where life still smoldered. An hour later, he found a thicket of widow's nettles, gray-green leaves, stiff stems, a sharp, bitter smell. He crouched down and examined the plant. He touched a leaf. It burned his skin, like real nettles, only stronger. He sniffed a broken stem. Bitterness, alkaloids, potent, but a familiar pattern. Many poisonous plants in his world became medicines after heat treatment. Cassava is deadly poisonous when raw and feeds 500 million people after cooking. So Jin gathered an armful. His hands burned from the stings. He wrapped his palms in cloth and gathered more. He returned 4 hours later, dirty, scorched, with an armful of poisonous grass. At the camp, 2 women were herbalists. One was a former midwife, the other a bankrupt pharmacist. So Jin spread the grass out on the rocks and explained. The leaf is bitter because of an alkaloid. It's soluble in water. If you scald the leaves with boiling water and drain the first batch, 80% of the poison will be removed. If you brew it in the second batch of water over low heat, you'll get a fever-reducing decoction. The salts from the stem will provide electrolytes. The midwife looked at him as if he were a heretic. The pharmacist asked questions, many, quickly. So Jin answered. Chemistry didn't change from world to world. Alkaloids remained alkaloids. Thermal denaturation worked everywhere. By evening, the decoction was ready. Cloudy, bitter, hot. So Jin tasted it first. He waited an hour. Nothing. No symptoms. He let the apothecary. She waited half an hour and nodded. Safe. The girl drank the decoction in 3 doses. Her mother held her head. By nightfall, the fever began to subside. By morning on the 4th day, she opened her eyes. Her mother screamed with joy. So Jin sat to the side and rubbed his burned hands with a wet rag. There were 4 other sick children with him. He was giving them the same decoction. By morning, all 4 were on the mend. The midwife approached him and knelt down. So Jin jumped up and lifted her by the elbows. He said there was no need for that it was just nettles. You just had to boil them twice. Moongil stood nearby. He looked at So Jin and said quietly and evenly, Mr. Farmer. In this forest, no one had spoken a simple word in 200 years. So Jin didn't know what to say. He remained silent. He turned away and went to check the garden bed. The seeds had sprouted. All 12 barley grains had sprouted in 3 days. It was impossible. Barley sprouts on the 7th day at the earliest. So Jin crouched down and touched the thin green stalk. It was warm, alive. The soil around it was a different color, not black, dark brown, normal, healthy. A circle 2 palms in diameter around each sprout. 12 small circles of healthy soil in the midst of black rot. So Jin scooped up a handful of the soil and sniffed it. The smell had changed. The sourness was gone. The normal scent of living soil had returned. That very scent he knew better than any perfume. The scent of soil ready to grow. The system responded again. Quiet, warm, like a hand on his shoulder. It told him without words that his field was working. That every seed planted by his hand was purifying the soil around it. Slowly, but surely. And that the more he planted, the more soil would come back to life. So Jin stood up. He looked at the black forest around him, at the endless rot, at the fog, at the dead trees. Then he looked at the 12 green sprouts at his feet, and for the first time in 4 days in this world, he smiled. By the 7th day, the barley was knee-high. So Jin measured its height with his palms every morning, and every morning he couldn't believe his eyes. In his past life, such growth rates were seen only in experimental varieties under the ideal conditions of a controlled greenhouse. Temperature plus or minus half a degree, humidity under control, nutrient solutions on schedule. None of that existed here. Cold air, rotten soil, no fertilizers, and the barley was growing like crazy. The stalks were thick, sturdy, the leaves glossy. So Jin snapped his finger against a stalk and heard a sound. Solid, healthy, as if he'd tapped on good wood. He didn't understand it from a scientific standpoint, but he understood it from the standpoint of the system. His class accelerated growth. His hands were a catalyst. Every touch of a seed during planting triggered a process that this world explained as magic, but he couldn't explain it at all. And he didn't try. He just planted. There were 5 beds, then 8, then 12. Jin worked from dawn to dusk. He dug, he planted, he checked. Every seed with his hand, every sprout under his watch. He quickly understood the rule. If someone else planted a seed, it grew at a normal pace, slowly, laboriously. If he himself stuck the seed into the ground, even if he touched the seed for just a second before passing it on, growth accelerated 3-fold. The system only counted as personal involvement. He couldn't delegate. He couldn't give orders from the tent. He was required to work with his hands every day. No days off, no breaks. So Jin accepted this without complaint. He was used to working with his hands. 8 years on a hydroponic farm, night shifts, unloading, repairing equipment at 4 in the morning. This body was weaker, but habit was stronger than the body. People began to change. Not everyone, not right away, but he saw it. The loudmouth who had laughed at him on the first day now approached silently in the morning and picked up a tool. Not a homemade one. In a week, the guy with the broken nose, whose name was Han Dole, had learned to chip away at stones so that they turned into passable hoes. Rough, heavy, but functional. So Jin showed him what angle to sharpen them at, and Han Dol got it right on his third try. A woman with 2 children named Mrs. Yan took charge of the water. She organized a chain of 7 people who passed buckets from the stream to the garden beds. No one had assigned her to do it. She saw what needed to be done and did it herself. So Jin noticed this and nodded at her. She nodded back. Words weren't necessary. But not everything was changing for the better. On the 10th day, So Jin woke up to a scream. Moon Gil was standing by the garden bed, shaking his hands. Someone had pulled up 3 barley plants by the roots during the night. Just pulled them up. Of the 12, 9 remained. So Jin got up. He walked over. He looked at the holes in the ground. Neat. The plants had been pulled out by hand. Whole, roots and all, with a clump of soil. They hadn't been trampled, not damaged by accident. They'd been stolen. 3 barley plants that, in 2 weeks, would have yielded enough grain for 3 new rows. So Jin stood over the empty holes and said nothing. Something tightened inside him. Not anger. Bitterness. Heavy and dull. He scanned the camp. 112 faces. One of them had come to his garden bed at night, to his field, and taken what everyone else's survival depended on. Han Dol approached from behind and said he knew who had done it, a man named Sok Bae, a former thief, convicted of stealing 5 sacks of flour. In the morning, his hands bore green stains from the stalks. Han Dol said he must be punished, exemplarily, so others wouldn't be tempted. So Jin looked at Han Dol, then at Sok Bae, who was sitting by the far campfire and trying not to look their way. So Jin walked over to him, sat down next to him. Sok Bae tensed up. He hid his hands, with the green stains, behind his back. So Jin asked calmly, did he eat them raw or cook them? Sok Bae flinched. He remained silent. So Jin said that raw barley at this stage has almost no nutritional value. The grain hadn't formed yet. He'd pulled up the plants for nothing. He'd killed 3 bushes and gotten nothing in return. Sok Bae slumped. So Jin was silent for a moment. Then he said that in 20 days, the barley would produce real grain, nutritious, filling. And then he would personally fill Sok Bae's bowl to the brim. But for that to happen, the remaining 9 bushes need to survive until harvest. Sok Bae raised his head and looked at him. There was neither remorse nor arrogance in his eyes, only hunger. The ordinary, dull hunger of a man who hasn't eaten properly in a very long time. So Jin stood up. He said that for dinner there would be a stew made from nettles and roots he had found yesterday. It wouldn't be filling, but it would fill their stomachs. Sok Bae nodded. Han Dol was furious. He approached So Jin and said that leniency would ruin them all. If the thief isn't punished, tomorrow they'll uproot 3 more bushes, and the day after tomorrow, all 12. So Jin replied that Han Dol was 70% right. But punishment only works when people have something to lose, and Sok Bae has nothing. He's an exile in this cursed forest. Things couldn't get any worse for him than they are now. The only thing that can stop him is the hope that tomorrow will be better. Han Dol listened. He spat. He said that So Jin was too soft to be a leader. So Jin replied that he wasn't a leader. He was a farmer, and his job was to make sure the food grew. The rest would sort itself out somehow. Han Dol left. So Jin returned to the garden. The 9 remaining bushes stood straight, green, strong. He knelt down and began loosening the soil around each one, with his fingers, carefully, like a surgeon. By the 20th day, the camp was beginning to take shape. Not a village, not a settlement, just organized chaos instead of disorganized chaos. So Jin divided the people into groups, not by order, by suggestion. Those who know how to dig ditches and expand the drainage system. Those who know how to work with wood cut stakes for the fence. Those who know herbs go with him into the forest and learn to distinguish the edible from poisonous. The children gathered dry brushwood and stones for the fire pits. The elderly, who cannot do physical labor, tend the fire and care for the sick. Lady Yan became the unofficial organizer of daily life. She distributed water. She kept things clean. She settled minor quarrels. So Jin did not appoint her. She took on this role herself. And she did it better than he could have. On the 25th day, the first nighttime attack occurred. Not a lone creature at the edge of a ditch. A full-scale attack. So Jin sensed it an hour before sunset. The ground was shaking, differently than usual, deeper, heavier, as if something enormous was coming toward them from the very heart of the forest. He roused the people. He ordered all the children and the elderly to be taken to the center of the camp. Light torches along the perimeter. Men with stakes stand by the fence. The fence. He'd been building it for 10 days. Stakes made from the black trees of Garam, driven into the ground along the ditches. He'd driven each one in himself. He touched each stake with his hands before setting it, and that changed them. Stakes driven in by other people remained mere sticks. His stakes took root, literally. Thin white threads extended from the base into the ground and intertwined with the roots of his barley. The fence was alive. Not a dead fence, a living wall that grew along with his field. The creature emerged from the mist at dusk, so Jin saw it for the first time in the light. 4 legs. Its body was covered in something like black bark. It had no eyes. Instead of a head, there was a growth like a broken tree trunk from which long white tendrils protruded. They moved. They felt their way through the air. The creature was the size of a horse. 2 more followed behind it, smaller ones. So Jin stood by the fence and watched. Han Dole and 7 other men stood nearby, holding spears. Their hands were all shaking. The creatures approached the ditch. They stopped. The large one thrust its tendrils forward. It pulled back. The line held. But the creature didn't leave. It began to circle the camp, slowly, methodically, looking for a weak spot. So Jin closed his eyes and listened to the ground. It showed him the perimeter, every ditch, every stake. He saw it all as a map in his head, and he saw where it was weak, the northeast corner. There, the fence stood on a section he hadn't had time to plant, dead ground, a shallow ditch, stakes without roots. He ran. Han Dole followed him. They made it there a minute before the creatures. The big one approached the weak spot and leaned against the fence. The stakes creaked. So Jin grabbed the nearest stake with both hands and pressed it into the ground. He put everything he could into it. Not strength, not magic, just a touch. Just contact with the earth through the stake. The system responded. The stake trembled. White roots began to crawl out from its base. Quickly, greedily, they dug into the ground. The stake grew stronger. But the huge creature was pressing down. A second stake cracked nearby. Han Dole stepped into the breach and jabbed the creature in the face with a stake. It recoiled. It screeched, a sound like iron scraping against glass. So Jin pulled 2 stakes from the spare pile and drove them into the ground with his play. 1, 2. It touched. The roots spread. The fence closed. The creature pressed down again. The fence held. 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 It pressed down with all its weight. The roots groaned. The stakes bent. So Jin clung to the fence and pressed his back against it. He closed his eyes and poured everything he had into the ground. Every drop of that incomprehensible resource the system gave him. The ground beneath the fence flared up, not with fire, with light, a warm green light. The fence's roots shot deep into the ground and out to the sides. They entwined with one another. They thickened. The fence became a wall. The creature whimpered. It retreated. It turned around and vanished into the fog. The 2 little ones followed it. So Jin slid down the wall to the ground. He couldn't move. His body was empty, like a wrung-out rag. Han Dole stood over him, breathing heavily. The stake in his hands was covered in black slime. He looked down at So Jin. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he was taking his words back. That leniency had nothing to do with it, and that if this fence had stood up to such vermin, he didn't care what rank the village head held. So Jin tried to smile. It didn't work. His lips wouldn't obey him. He said hoarsely that he wasn't the village head. Han Dol replied that he was already the village head, whether he wanted it or not. The porridge was watery, a handful of grain to a bucket of water. So Jin stood by the fire and stirred it himself with a wooden stick. Steam rose into the cold air and smelled so good that people began to gather long before the porridge was ready. They stood in silence, waiting. The children hid behind their mothers and sniffed the air. The old people sat on rocks and stared at the bucket without looking away. So Jin served it out himself, into everyone's hands. There were no bowls. There were stumps of bark. There were palms cupped like boats. There were shards of clay pots that someone had gathered in the ruins of the old camp. He gave everyone the same amount, 3 full ladles, no more, no less. The children first, then the elderly, then the women, then the men. The last one got just as much as the first. So Jin watched. He had been waiting for this. He knew it would happen, but didn't know exactly how. Mrs. Yan was the first to react. She finished her portion, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, froze, looked at her hands, then at So Jin, then back at her hands. She said she felt warm, that she hadn't felt warm since the day she was abandoned here. But now she felt warm, from the inside, as if someone had lit a small fire right in her chest. So Jin nodded, puff. The system called it Garam satiety, resistance to fear, accelerated regeneration, restful sleep. He didn't know the exact numbers. He didn't see any scales or percentages, but he saw Ms. Yan's shoulders straighten. How the old man sitting next to him stopped shaking. How the 10-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word since day one suddenly lifted his head and looked around with normal, lively eyes. By evening, the difference was visible to the naked eye. The people who had eaten the porridge walked straighter. They spoke more calmly. They slept more soundly. The coughs that had tormented half the camp grew quieter. The children who had woken screaming from nightmares that night slept in silence. The apothecary, whose name was Hua Ryong, approached So Jin in the morning and said that overnight, a cut on her hand, which had been festering for 10 days, had healed. She showed him her palm, a fresh pink scar where the wound had been. So Jin looked at it. He nodded. Hua Ryong asked what he had put in the porridge. So Jin replied that he hadn't put anything in it, just ordinary barley from his garden. Hua Ryong shook her head and said that ordinary barley doesn't work that way. So Jin didn't argue. He knew himself that ordinary barley doesn't work that way. 5 sacks weren't enough. They were catastrophically insufficient. So Jin sat by the fire that evening and did the math. 112 people. At least 300 grams of grain per person per day to avoid starving to death. That's 34 kilograms a day, 1,000 kilograms a month. He had 5 sacks, about 200 kilograms, enough for 6 days. And that's if he didn't set any aside for seeds. But he needed to set aside at least half for seeds, so that meant 3 days. 3 days of being full, and then hunger again. Unless he planted everything he could right now. For the next 10 days, So Jin slept no more than 3 hours a day. He was planting. Every inch of space inside the fence, every patch of cleared ground. Barley was the main crop, beans between the rows, pumpkins along the edges. He worked out the plan in a single night. He drew it on the ground with a stick by the light of the campfire and explained it to Moon Gil. Barley draws nitrogen from the soil. Beans fix nitrogen from the air through nodules on their roots and return it to the soil. Pumpkins spread across the ground and keep it from drying out. The 3 crops help each other. In his world, this was called companion planting. The indigenous peoples of Central America had used this technique for thousands of years. Corn, beans, and pumpkins, the 3 sisters. With So Jin adapted the scheme to what he had available. Moon Gil listened with his mouth agape. Then he said he'd never heard of plants helping each other. That at the monastery, each crop was planted separately. So Jin replied that plants aren't stupid. They've been surviving for millions of years. They learned to cooperate long ago. It's just that people don't always notice it. On the 35th day, So Jin went into the forest alone. He did this regularly, every 3 or 4 days. He was searching for herbs, roots, mushrooms, anything that could be eaten or used. The earth guided him like a guide. It showed him safe paths. It warned him of creatures. That day, it led him farther than usual, north, through windfall and dead glades. So Jin walked for 2 hours. Then the earth told him to stop. He stood before ruins, stone walls, a collapsed roof, columns entwined with black moss. A temple, ancient, abandoned. So Jin went inside. The floor was covered with moss and fallen leaves. In the center stood a stone altar, cracked, lopsided. A layer of dust as thick as a palm lay on it. And behind the altar, someone was there. So Jin heard the breathing before he saw the figure. Quiet, hoarse, cautious. He walked around the altar. A girl was sitting on the floor, thin to the point of transparency. A dirty, tattered robe, bare feet covered in scrapes, hair tangled into knots. She was clutching a clay bowl to her chest and looking straight at him. No, not looking. Her eyes were closed. Not shut tight, closed. Her eyelids smooth and motionless. She was blind. So Jin stopped. The girl turned her head at the sound of his footsteps. Her hands clenched the bowl tighter. She said quietly and hoarsely for him to leave, that she was already dead and he had nothing to take from her. So Jin crouched down. He was 3 steps away from her. He could see she wasn't just thin. She was on the brink. 1 more day, maybe 2, then her body would simply stop. He asked how long she'd been there. She replied that she hadn't counted, maybe a year, maybe 3. So Jin asked what she had been eating. She said mushrooms from the temple floor and rainwater from a crack in the ceiling. 3 years, in complete darkness, alone, in a dead forest, on mushrooms and rainwater. So Jin swallowed the lump in his throat. He pulled a flatbread from his bosom. Small, rough, made from barley flour they ground with stones. He held it out to the girl. She didn't move. He placed the flatbread on the floor in front of her. He told her it was bread, that it wasn't poisoned or cursed, that it was baked from barley that grew in a field 3 hours' walk from here. She froze. Then she slowly reached out her hand. She found the flatbread with her fingers, brought it to her nose, sniffed it. Her face twitched. She broke off a piece and put it in her mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed with difficulty. Then she finished it all. So Jin waited. Garam's satiety buff took effect after a minute. Her back straightened. Her hands stopped trembling. Her breathing evened out. She lifted her face. She said she felt warm, that she felt warm for the first time in 3 years. So Jin said his name was Park So Jin, that he was a farmer, that he had a village 3 hours away, that there was food and people there, and a warm place by the fire, and that he hadn't come here for her because he didn't know she was here, but now he knew, and he couldn't leave without her. The girl was silent for a long time. Then she said her name was Yoon-mi, that she was a priestess of the earth god, the last priestess, that her order was destroyed when she was a teenager, that the crown's soldiers came at night and burned the monastery, that her god fell silent that night and never answered again, that she had come to this temple to die. So Jin listened. Then he stood up. He held out his hand. He said she didn't have to die, that he was short-handed in his village, that if she was a priestess of the god of the earth, then her place was in the field growing in the middle of the cursed forest. Yoon-mi raised her hand, slowly. She found his palm. Her fingers were icy, thin, like twigs. She clasped his hand, and he felt her whole body trembling. He helped her stand up. She was lighter than he had thought, as if there was nothing inside her but bones and stubbornness. The return trip took 5 hours. Yoon-mi walked slowly, holding on to his hand. With her other hand, she pressed the bowl from the temple to her chest. So Jin didn't rush her. He led her along the path the ground seemed to show. He stepped around roots. He warned her about rocks. When she stumbled, he caught her by the waist and steadied her. She froze at his touch. Then she said quietly that no one had touched her. So Jin didn't answer. He just kept walking. He held her hand tightly. He didn't let go. By the time they reached the camp, it was already getting dark. Moon Gil saw them first. He ran up. He looked at Yoon Mi. He turned pale. He said that it was the robe of the Jivan order. He said the Jivan order had been destroyed 20 years ago for heresy, that all the priestesses were dead. So Jin replied that not all of them were. Moon Gil looked at Yoon Mi, then at So Jin. Then he slowly dropped to one knee. Yoon Mi heard this. She turned her head. She said it wasn't necessary, that she didn't deserve a bow, that she had abandoned her post and gone to die. Moon Gil replied without rising from his knee, that the earth god had kept her in the dead forest for 3 years, that it wasn't cowardice, it was waiting. Yoon Mi clutched the bowl. Her lips trembled, but she didn't cry, not now. So Jin led her to the fire. He gave her a bowl of porridge, warm, thick, with beans. Yoon Mi ate slowly, carefully, every spoonful. When she finished, she set the bowl on the ground. She straightened up. She ran her fingers over the ground where she had been sitting, slowly, as if reading something written in too small a font. Then she froze. So Jin saw how her face had changed, how her blind eyes behind her closed eyelids seemed to widen. She said one word, alive. So Jin asked what was alive. Yoon Mi said the earth, that the earth beneath her was alive, that she could feel the roots and the water and the warmth, that there was no earth like this in Garam. There shouldn't be. So Jin replied that it was his field, that he had planted barley and beans there, that the earth had cleansed itself. Yoon Mi fell silent for a long time. Then tears streamed down her face, the first in 3 years. She said quietly, "He is alive. He was just waiting for someone to start sowing again." So Jin didn't understand. He asked who he was. Yoon Mi answered, "The god of the earth." He didn't die. He was just waiting. So Jin wanted to say that he didn't believe in gods, that he was an agronomist, that the soil was being cleansed because of drainage and biology. But he kept quiet, because the tears on the face of the blind girl who had lived in darkness for 3 years on mushrooms and rainwater were real. And if her god had come back to life because So Jin planted barley, then let him live. He sat down next to her by the fire, silently, and they sat there like that until dawn. Yoon Mi hadn't gotten out of bed for 3 days, so Jin had found her a spot in the warmest corner of the barracks by the far wall where there was no draft. Hua Ryong examined her and said that what was surprising wasn't that she was sick, but that she was alive at all. 4th-degree exhaustion, muscle atrophy, deficient in everything imaginable. Hua Ryong gave her a decoction of widow's nettle to drink. She fed her barley porridge 3 spoonfuls at a time, no more than that. Her stomach had forgotten how to handle food and might not have been able to handle it. So Jin came every morning and every evening. He brought fresh water. He changed the bedding made of dry grass. He sat down beside her. He was silent. Yoon Mi lay there and listened. She heard everything. How people walked outside, how hoes struck the ground, how children ran between the barracks, how the wind rustled through the barley in the fields. On the 3rd day, she sat up. She asked to be taken out to the field. So Jin took her by the hand and led her out. The field had grown. During the 3 days that Yoon Mi had been lying there, So Jin had planted 4 more rows. Now the entire central part of the camp was green. The barley stood waist-high. The beans were in bloom. The pumpkin vines spread out in all directions. Yoon Mi walked along the edge of the bed and touched the ears of grain with her fingers. Her face changed with every step. The tension left her jaw. Her lips relaxed. Her shoulders dropped. She stopped in the middle of the field and knelt down. She pressed her palms to the ground. She closed her eyes, though they were already closed. So Jin stood nearby and waited. Yoon Mi said that the earth was speaking to her, that she could feel every root, every drop of water in the soil, every worm, every stone. She said the earth was clean 3 meters deep and that the clean zone was expanding, slowly. The width of a palm every day, but it was expanding. So Jin did the math. A palm a day, that's about 10 centimeters, half a meter a week, 2 meters a month. In 6 months, the perimeter of his field will increase by 12 meters in all directions. Not fast, but not insignificant either. If he plants more beds, the purification zones will begin to overlap and the process will speed up. Yoon Mi asked how many he had planted. So Jin replied that he had planted 12 beds, about 100 square meters. Yoon Mi nodded. Then she said that if he'd let her, she'd pray in his field every morning. That her prayer wouldn't do anything for the harvest, but it would give the earth peace. So Jin replied that she could pray as much as she wanted. Yoon Mi smiled. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, the smile was small, timid, like a sprout that had just broken through the soil. On the 42nd day, So Jin began to build. Not garden beds, structures. First, a granary. The grain was growing. The second barley harvest yielded 3 sacks, then 5, then 7. There was nowhere to store them. Mice also lived in Garam. Not ordinary mice, black, with red eyes, the size of a cat. They were drawn by the scent of grain and gnawed through a sack in a single night. So Jin lost 20 kilograms. He stood over the gnawed sack that morning, clenching his fists. 20 kilograms. That's 2 days' worth of food for the entire camp. He couldn't afford such losses. It took 10 days to build the granary. So Jin sketched out a plan on the ground with a stick. Log walls, the floor raised on stones so the mice couldn't get in. A roof of poles and a thick layer of dried grass. He worked alongside everyone else. He hewed logs, he carried stones, he drove in stakes, and he touched every log as it was set in place. Every single one. Because he already knew. The structure he built with his own hands on his field came to life. The wood didn't rot, it didn't mold, it didn't dry out. The gaps between the logs closed on their own. Thin roots sprouted from one log into another and bound them tighter than any nail. The barn stood on the 11th day, sturdy, warm, dry. So Jin placed his palm on the wall and felt the wood breathe, alive. Moon Gil stood nearby and shook his head. He had seen many buildings in his life, monasteries, peasant ones, noble ones. None of them looked like this. This barn stood in the cursed forest, as if it had always been there, as if it had grown out of the ground itself. So Jin poured grain inside and closed the door. The mice came at night and couldn't get close. The barn repelled them just as a fence repels beasts. A living structure on his land was his territory, and on his territory, he decided who could enter. So Jin didn't stop at the granary. Over the next 2 weeks, he built a canopy over the well, 2 barracks for people, long ones, for 20 people each, with stone stoves in the center and chimneys made of clay pipes that Han Dol had fashioned according to his blueprints. A 3rd barrack for children and mothers, separate, with double walls, with windows made of oiled cloth. So Jin now slept only 2 hours a day. He couldn't stop. Every day without a roof over their heads meant illness. Every illness meant death. Every death was his fault. He didn't say this out loud, but everyone saw it. How he swayed from exhaustion as he walked. How he fell asleep standing up and woke up with his forehead pressed against a log. How his hands trembled when he lifted the hoe. On the 52nd day, Mrs. Yan intercepted him on his way to the garden. She stood in front of him. She planted her feet wide apart. She put her hands on her hips. And she said that if he didn't get at least 6 hours of sleep, she would personally tie him up and put him in the barracks. So Jin opened his mouth to object. Mrs. Yan said it wasn't a request. That she was a mother of 2 and knew what a person looked like when they were killing themselves with work. That the fields wouldn't go anywhere in 6 hours. And that the fields didn't need a dead foreman. So Jin shut his mouth. He looked at her. He looked at Moon Gil, who was standing nearby and nodding. He looked at Han Dol, who was leaning against the barracks wall and nodding too. So Jin sighed. He said, okay. He went into the barracks. He lay down. He fell asleep in 4 seconds. He slept for 9 hours. When he woke up, the field had been watered. The ditches had been cleared. The weeds had been pulled. Mrs. Yan was standing at the entrance with a bowl of porridge in her hands and said that nothing had collapsed while he was sleeping. So Jin took the bowl. He ate. For the first time in 2 months, he ate while sitting down, not on the go. On the 55th day, he fixed the water supply. A stream flowed 100 paces east of the camp. The water in it was murky. It had an iron taste. Not poisonous, but not clean either. So Jin dug a canal from the stream to the camp for 3 days, alone. Because the canal had to be his, dug by his own hands, on his land. Then the water in it would be clean. He didn't know why the system worked that way, but it did. The water flowing through his canal lost its murkiness. The iron taste faded. It became what it was supposed to be: clean, clear, cold. When the water reached the camp, people stood along the canal and watched in silence. Clean water in Garam. For many of them, it was a miracle on the level of resurrection. Yoon-mi grew stronger. By the 50th day, she was walking on her own, slowly, but confidently. She knew the camp by heart, every stone, every turn, every step. She walked barefoot through the field every morning and touched the ears of grain. And every morning she quietly whispered a prayer that no one heard, or thought they didn't hear. So Jin heard it, once, by accident. He came to the field before dawn to check the beds and heard her voice, quiet, steady. She thanked the God of the earth for every grain, for every root, for every drop of water, for the fact that he had awakened, for the fact that he had sent her a man who knew how to sow. So Jin stood in the darkness and did not move. He had a strange feeling inside, warm and uncomfortable at the same time. He wasn't used to being the one people prayed to. On the 60th day, everything changed. So Jin stood at the edge of the field and looked north. The fog was thicker than usual. The earth hummed. Not like before the creature's attack. Different, quieter, but broader. As if the entire forest around them had contracted on an inhale and was in no hurry to exhale. Yoon-mi approached and stood beside him. She said the forest was watching. So Jin asked what she meant. Yoon-mi replied that Garam wasn't just a forest, that there was something in it, deep inside, in the center. Something that sleeps, or slept, and now it has woken up. Because it sensed that someone was clearing its land. So Jin asked what that meant for them. Yoon-mi paused. Then she said that before, the creatures used to come to the camp by accident. They'd wander around, stumble upon the fence and leave. Now they'll come with a purpose. They'll be sent. Whatever sits deep within Garam wants to stop his fields. So Jin closed his eyes. He clenched his teeth. Of course, it would be too easy if they let him plant barley in peace forever. He asked how much time they had. Yoon-mi replied that she didn't know. Maybe a week, maybe 3 days. So Jin opened his eyes. He looked at the field, at the green barley, at the blooming beans, at the huts made of living wood, at the people walking between the rows, doing what he had taught them to do. 112 people, children, old people, mothers, the thief Sok-bae, who now came to the garden first every day. The young man Han-dol, who carved stones better than any master. Lady Yeon, who held the camp together more firmly than any foundation. Moongil, who knew the names of every herb in the forest. Hwa-ryung, who brewed medicine from what she had once considered poison. And Yoon-mi, the blind girl who had waited in the darkness for 3 years. So Jin turned to her. He said he needed a fence, a real one, not stakes in the ground, a wall, around the entire field, around all the barracks, around the well and the barn and the canal, a wall of living wood that no creature could break through. Yoon-mi nodded. She said that if he planted it, she would pray, that her prayer wouldn't make the tree grow, but it would calm the earth, and calm earth grows faster. So Jin looked at her closed eyes, at her delicate face, at the hands holding the clay bowl. He nodded, and went to Han-dol. He needed stakes, lots of stakes, more than they had ever cut down. For the next 5 days, So Jin built the wall. He drove stakes into the ground around the perimeter of the field, spaced a step apart. He held each stake in his hands before driving it in. He touched each one. He gave a part of himself to each one. The men chopped down trees in the forest and hauled them back to the camp. The women stripped the trunks of bark and branches. The children gathered stones for the foundation. Everyone worked. Everyone. Even the sick. even Sok Pei. He hauled logs in silence, without breaks, so Jin noticed and put a double portion of porridge in his bowl that evening. Sok Pei looked at the bowl, then at So Jin, then he took it and walked off to eat by himself. He was still ashamed. So Jin didn't try to comfort him. His shame was justified, but the porridge was justified too. On the 63rd day, the wall closed, a circle, 200 meters in diameter, stakes in 2 rows, the gaps filled with clay and stones. Roots sprouted from each stake into the ground and intertwined into an underground network. So Jin placed his palm on the wall and closed his eyes. He could feel everything, every stake, every root, every stone. The wall was a single living organism, his organism, and it was ready. The creatures came on the 64th night. So Jin sensed them an hour before sunset. The earth was screaming. Not humming, it was screaming. He gathered the people, everyone to the center, the children to the barracks, torches against the wall. Lady Yan stood at the door of the children's barracks with an axe in her hands. Han Dole and 10 men took up positions by the wall. Yun Mi stood in the center of the field. She dropped to her knees, pressed her palms to the ground, began to pray. So Jin stood on the wall, looked into the fog, and saw them. Many, not 3, not 5, dozens. They were emerging from the fog from all sides, different, big and small, 4-legged and legless, with appendages and without. They were coming toward his wall, toward his field, toward his people. So Jin clenched his fists. He looked down at his hands, dirty, worn, calloused and scraped. A farmer's hands, rank F, no application. He smirked and remained standing. The first creature slammed into the wall from the north, so Jin felt it in his feet. The vibration traveled through the stakes into the ground, and through the ground into the soles of his feet. He spun around, ran along the crest of the wall toward the northern section. Torches cast a jagged light into the fog. The creature was large, larger than those that had come before. Its body was covered in black bark, 6 legs, each as thick as a log. It was ramming its forehead into the wall, methodically, time and again, like a battering ram. The stakes creaked, the roots groaned, but they held. So Jin placed both palms on the nearest stake and poured everything he had into it. The system responded. The roots shot deep, they thickened, the stake grew stronger. The creature struck again, the wall held. The creature retreated a step, and at that moment, a second one struck from the east. So Jin ran. The wall was 200 meters long. He couldn't make it in time. The eastern section groaned. 3 stakes cracked simultaneously. Han Dole stood in the breach, stake raised. He jabbed the creature in the face. It recoiled. Han Dole shouted that there were 4 of them on this side. So Jin reached them. He fell to his knees. He clung to the base of the cracked stake. He drove it in. The roots took hold. But slowly. He was exhausted. The system was draining something from him. Not mana, not magic. Strength. Ordinary human strength. Every thrust drained his body like a 12-hour shift without a break. And there were many creatures. They pressed in from all sides. The wall groaned. It creaked. But it didn't break. Yun Mi was praying in the center of the field. So Jin couldn't see her, but he could feel her through the earth. Her prayer was doing something to the soil, calming it, as if she were placing a warm hand on a feverish forehead. The ground beneath the wall stopped trembling. The roots steadied. The stakes straightened. So Jin exhaled. He stood up. He ran to the next section. And so it went all night. From the north wall to the east, from the east to the south, from the south to the west. He ran in circles like a squirrel in a wheel. He placed his hands on the stakes. He put his energy into them. He ran on. By dawn, his legs could no longer hold him. He fell to his knees by the western wall and couldn't get up. Han Dole ran over. He lifted him under the arms, dragged him to the fire. So Jin wheezed that they needed to check the wall. Han Dole said the wall was standing, that the creatures had left, that dawn had driven them away. So Jin closed his eyes and fell into the darkness. He slept for a full day. When he opened his eyes, Yun Mi was sitting over him. She was holding his hand with both of hers. Her fingers were warm. So Jin didn't immediately realize what had changed. Then he understood. Her hands were warm. Before, they had been icy, always, even by the fire. But now they were warm. Yoon-mi sensed that he had woken up. She told him he was an idiot, that he had nearly killed himself, that you can't invest so much in a single night. Seo Jin asked how she knew how much he'd invested. Yoon-mi replied that the earth had told her, that his field had been screaming all night, not from pain, from fear, because it sensed its master becoming empty. Seo Jin was silent for a moment. Then he said he didn't know a field could be afraid. Yoon-mi squeezed his hand tighter and said that the field was him, his hands, his sweat, his blood. Of course it was afraid when he was dying. So Jin sat down. His head was spinning. His body ached. But he was alive. The wall stood. The people were safe. Not a single casualty. He asked how many creatures had come. Han Dole, who was standing at the entrance, replied that he had counted 23. But there might have been more. It's hard to count in the fog. 23 creatures in a single night. Before, they used to come 3 at a time, 5 at a time. Yoon-mi was right. Garam had awakened, and he was angry. So Jin spent the next few days fortifying the area. He realized his mistake. You can't hold the wall alone. You can't be the only point of strength. You need depth. He began planting trees. Not inside the wall, outside, between the wall and the forest, a strip 10 paces wide. He gathered seeds from Garam's black trees. They looked dead, dry, twisted. But when he took them in his hands and squeezed them, he felt a spark inside. Life, tiny, crushed, but alive. He planted the first black tree seed 2 paces from the wall, watered it from his canal, pressed the soil with his palm, and waited. A sprout broke through 3 days later, but not black, green, an ordinary green sprout with 2 little leaves, as if a perfectly normal plant had emerged from the dead seed of a cursed tree. So Jin touched it, healthy, strong, growing fast. His soil purified the seed just as it purified the ground. It took away the curse. It left life behind. He planted 20 more seeds, then 30 more. By the end of the week, young shoots were rising up against the wall. Not very tall, knee-high, but alive. And every tree became part of his perimeter, an additional line of defense. The creatures now had to pass through a strip of living trees before reaching the wall. And the living trees on his land repelled the evil just as the fence did. On the 70th day, Seo Jin counted the people. 109. 3 had died in the first 2 weeks. An old man with a bad heart, a woman who refused to eat or drink, a 3-month-old baby. Seo Jin remembered each one. He remembered the old man's face, the woman's hands, the baby's voice. He buried them behind the wall, dug the graves himself, planted flowers on each one, wildflowers found in the forest, little white flowers that Moon-gil called the tears of the sky. Every morning, Seo Jin walked past the graves on his way to the field. Every morning, he stopped for a second. He didn't pray, he just stood there. Then he walked on. Yoon-mi once asked why he stopped. Seo Jin replied that he was counting. Yoon-mi asked what he was counting. Seo Jin said, a debt. He owed this place 109 lives. He could never bring back the 3 he had lost. He had to preserve the remaining 109. Yoon-mi remained silent. Then she said quietly that you couldn't count a debt in terms of people. Seo Jin replied that he had no other currency. On the 75th day, Seo Jin began building a mill. There was enough grain to grind. Whole grain barley porridge provided sustenance, but flour made bread, and bread gave people what porridge could not: normality. The smell of fresh bread in a village made of living wood in the middle of a cursed forest. That was more important than calories. He built the mill from memory. In his world, he had seen reconstructions of water mills at the Folk Life Museum near Suwon. The principle was simple. Water falls on the blades of the wheel. The wheel turns the millstone. The mill grinds the grain. All he needed was a drop in elevation. So Jin found a spot where the stream made a bend and dropped 1/2 meter. He built a dam out of stones and clay. He carved the blades out of black wood. Han Dol hewn the millstones from 2 flat boulders. The work took 12 days. When the wheel turned for the first time and the millstone ground against the grain, Moon Gil wept. Quietly, to the side. He thought no one could see. So Jin saw. He said nothing. Let the old man cry it out. They baked their first bread on the 88th day. Lady Yan kneaded the dough. Coarse, heavy. No yeast, no salt, just flour and water. They baked the flatbreads on stones by the fire. The smell wafted through the camp, and people began to gather, silently. They stood and watched as the dough darkened on the hot stone. So Jin handed out the flatbreads personally, 1 to each person, warm, dense, with a crust. The children ate and laughed. The old people ate and were silent. The women ate and cried. The men ate and turned away so as not to show their faces. So Jin stood by the fire. He watched the 109 people eating the bread, his bread, from his grain, from his field, grown by his own hands in the cursed forest where they had been cast out to die. And for the first time, he thought that maybe they really would survive. On the 99th day, So Jin headed south. Yoon Mi told him she sensed something. Far away, a half-day's walk. Something alive. Not a creature, not a beast, a human. So Jin took Han Dol and 2 other men with him. They walked for half a day. The ground led him through the forest, past dead clearings, through windfall, along dried-up streams. By noon they came out into a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood the remains of a camp, an old one, a long abandoned one, collapsed huts, black circles from campfires, rusty shards of tools, the previous group of exiles, those who came before them. So Jin looked at the remains and realized these people hadn't lasted long, maybe a month, maybe 2. Then the forest took them. A sound came from the right, quiet, metallic, as if someone had plucked a string. So Jin turned around. Han Dol raised his stake. 2 men stood behind him. A girl emerged from behind the debris of a shelter. No, not a girl, a creature. Reddish ears poked out from tangled hair. A long, fluffy tail peeked out from behind her back. Dirty, matted. She stood on one leg. The other was tucked under. A silver loop protruded from the wrist of her left hand. A thin wire cut into the flesh, and the skin around it was swollen and blackened. A poacher's trap. Silver, for beastmen. So Jin had seen such traps in the illustrations in the books that Moon Gil described to him in the evenings by the campfire. Beastmen in Haedong are treated like livestock. They are hunted, sold, branded, and the traps for them are made of silver because silver burns their skin and prevents them from breaking free. The girl looked at them with the eyes of a cornered beast, yellow, with vertical pupils. She pressed her back against the debris of the hut and bared her small, sharp teeth. Han Dol took a step forward. She hissed. So Jin placed a hand on Han Dol's shoulder and stopped him. Then he crouched down, slowly. He held out his empty palms. He said he wouldn't harm her, that he had come from a village to the north, that he had food and water. The girl stared at him and didn't move. So Jin took a flatbread from his bosom. He placed it on the ground in front of him. He stepped back. The girl didn't move. A minute passed, 2, 3. Then she slowly got down on all fours. She crawled over, sniffed the flatbread, grabbed it, shoved it whole into her mouth, chewed quickly, greedily, swallowed without chewing. So Jin waited. When she finished eating, he asked her name. She was silent. Then she said hoarsely, "Nam B." So Jin asked how long she'd been trapped. Nam B replied that it had been 3 days. That people had come, set a snare. She stepped on it. They didn't come back. Maybe they forgot. Maybe the creature took them. So Jin moved closer. Nam B flinched, bared her teeth. So Jin stopped. He said he wanted to remove the noose, that the silver would kill her if it stayed in the wound much longer. Nam B looked at him for a long time. Then she held out her hand. So Jin took her wrist, gently. Nam B flinched at his touch. He examined the noose. The wire had dug in deep. The skin around it was black from the burn. Pus, inflammation. Another day and blood poisoning would have set in. He turned to Han Dol and asked for a knife. Han Dol gave it to him. So Jin cut the wire in one swift motion. Nam Bi cried out, cruel, brutal. The wire fell into the mud. A deep groove remained on her wrist. So Jin washed the wound with water from a flask. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth. Nam Bi watched him, without blinking. Her pupils dilated. She said quietly that no one had ever taken the chain off her before. So Jin didn't answer. He examined her leg, bit through cleanly, an old wound, filthy, but not fatal. He treated it as best he could, bandaged it, said there was a herbalist in the village and that her leg would heal. Nam Bi walked on her own, limping, falling, getting up, refusing help. So Jin didn't insist. He walked beside her. When she fell for the third time and couldn't get up, he silently offered his shoulder. She clung to him, hot, light, like a child. They walked for 6 hours. By the time they reached Pakol, it was dark. So Jin led Nam Bi into the barn. It was the warmest place there. Dry. It smelled of grain. He poured a bowl of porridge with meat. He set it in front of her. He said, "Eat as much as you want, and come back tomorrow. I'll pour you some more." Nam Bi took the bowl. She ate. She cried. She finished. She cried. She asked for more. So Jin poured her another bowl. She finished the second bowl and fell asleep right on the sacks of grain. She curled up into a ball. She wrapped her tail around herself. She pressed her ears against her head. So Jin covered her with burlap. He went out. In the morning, he came back to check on her. Nam Bi was sitting in the same spot. She hadn't slept. She was staring at the door. She had been guarding his warehouse all night. So Jin stood in the doorway and looked at her. The little one, dirty, with a bandaged arm and leg, with a brand on her back that he saw when her robe slipped off her shoulder. So Jin clenched his teeth, turned away. Went to the garden. He needed to work, because if he stopped, he'd start thinking about who had branded the child's back, and if he started thinking about that, his hands would stop planting and start breaking things. Nam Bi didn't leave the barn for 4 days. She ate, she slept, she kept watch. So Jin brought her food 3 times a day: porridge in the morning, a flatbread at noon, bean soup in the evening. Each time he placed the bowl by the door. Each time he took 3 steps back. He waited. She took the bowl only when he stepped back, like a wild animal that takes food only when it's sure there's no trap. Huarion examined her on the second day. The leg was in bad shape. The infection was spreading upward. Huarion said the wound needed to be cleaned and the bandage every 6 hours. So Jin changed it himself. Nam Bi hissed in pain but didn't pull her leg away. She stared at him with yellow eyes, not blinking. On the 5th day, she left the barn for the first time. So Jin was standing by the garden bed, loosening the soil. He turned around. Nam Bi was standing in the barn doorway and squinting into the light. Her ears were pricked up. Her tail was twitching. She surveyed the camp, the people, the buildings, the field. Then she looked at So Jin and walked toward him, not to the people, not to the fire, to him. She stood beside him. She said she wanted to help. So Jin gave her a basket and showed her how to gather beans. From that day on, Nam Bi became his shadow. She followed him everywhere, in the field, to the wall, into the forest, to the stream. She was fast. Even with her injured leg, she was faster than anyone in Pakol. Her hearing was so keen that she could hear a mouse 100 paces away. Her sense of smell was even better. She could sense creatures in the fog long before the ground signaled their presence to So Jin. A week later, she started bringing back game, small animals that looked like rabbits, birds. Once she brought a fish from the stream downstream. So Jin didn't ask how she caught them. He just took the catch and cooked it for everyone. Every time he handed out the meat to the others, Nam Bi looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not resentment, not jealousy, surprise. as if she didn't understand why he was sharing what belonged to him. On the 100th day, So Jin taught Nambi her first word in Korean. It happened by accident. He was standing in the field, looking at the barley. It was the third planting cycle. The field had tripled in size. Greenery covered the entire space inside the wall. So Jin muttered to himself in Korean, "Beautiful." Nambi stood nearby and heard him. She repeated it. A strange sound came from her mouth. An unfamiliar word. So Jin looked at her. She looked at him. She asked what it meant. He replied that it was a word from his native language, that it meant when something was pleasing to the eye. Nambi repeated it again. Then she pointed to the field. Then at So Jin. He didn't understand. She didn't explain. She simply walked along the perimeter to check for tracks. By this time, Han Dole had become something of a guard captain. Not by appointment, just by default. He organized night watches. 10 men on the wall every night in shifts. Spears in hand. Torches along the perimeter. The creatures came regularly, every second or third night. But not in waves like that first night. 5 at a time. 7. The wall held. The trees in front of the wall held. Nambi became the chief sentry. She sat on the roof of the tallest barracks and listened to the forest. When she sensed the creatures, she let out a short, piercing whistle. The camp was on its feet within a minute. On the 105th day, So Jin realized he needed a smithy. The stone hoes were breaking. The wooden stakes were getting dull. He needed metal. Real metal. He asked Moon Gil if there was any iron in Garam. Moon Gil replied that the streams were full of brown stone. Bog ore. So Jin knew what that was. Limonite. Iron hydroxide. The simplest ore. Iron had been smelted from it thousands of years ago under the most primitive conditions. All that was needed was fire. A lot of fire. Among the exiles was a former blacksmith's apprentice, a young man named Tae-gon. He was 22, a blacksmith's mark on his wrist. His class was considered lowly, almost useless, but the guy had golden hands. So Jin explained the principle to him. Build a furnace out of stones, fill it with ore, fill it with charcoal from burnt wood. Fan the fire until the ore melts. Tae-gon listened. He nodded. 3 days later, they had built the furnace. Small, crooked, smoky, but it worked. The first smelting yielded a piece of iron the size of a fist. Dirty, porous, but it was iron. Real iron. Tae-gon took it in his hands. He turned it over. He tapped it. Then he looked at So Jin and smiled for the first time ever. So Jin nodded and said he needed hoes, 10 of them, and shovels, 20 of them, and knives, 30 of them. Tae-gon replied that it would take time. So Jin said they had time, they had grain too, and that Tae-gon could eat as much as he wanted while he worked. By the 120th day, Paeko looked like a real village. 30 buildings inside the wall, a granary, a mill, a smithy, 6 residential barracks, a well with a canopy for the kitchen, a canopy for drying herbs, a tool shed, and a small tower. So Jin built it on a hill in the center of the camp, 3 meters high, made of the thickest logs, with a platform on top. Nambi sat there every night and listened to the forest. The tower was alive, just like everything So Jin built. It sent roots downward and branches upward. A month later, leaves had grown on its roof. People had changed. So Jin saw it every day. Mrs. Yun no longer cried. She ran the kitchen and laundry with such energy that even Han Dole obeyed her. Moon Gil taught the children to read and write. He drew letters in the sand with a stick and made them repeat them. Hua Ryong gathered a supply of medicinal herbs and opened something like a pharmacy. A small table in the corner of the barracks with pots and little bags. Sokbei, who had stolen 3 barley plants on the 10th day, now got up before everyone else and went out to the field. Silently. He worked until sunset. Silently. He ate his portion. Silently. He went to sleep. So Jin never once reminded him of the theft. Sokbei never once thanked him for his silence. A balance had been established between them that needed no words. On the 125th day, So Jin heard a commotion from the south. Not a beast. People. Screams. Crying. He took Han Dole and 4 men. went outside the wall, walked south for half an hour, and found them. 13 people, ragged, skinny, barely alive. Women, children, 2 old men. They were wandering through the forest aimlessly, without a goal, without hope. So Jin approached the first old man. He asked where they were from. The old man looked at him with cloudy eyes and replied that they were from a village beyond the southern border of Garam, that the barren had raised taxes, that they couldn't pay, that soldiers had burned the village, that the survivors had fled into the forest, because at least in the forest there were no soldiers. So Jin listened. He turned to his men. He said, "Bring the stretcher and bring food for 13 people." That evening, 13 new residents sat by the fire and ate porridge. The children fell asleep right in their mother's arms. One of the old men ate and wept, not out of joy, out of shame. He said that all his life he had believed that only the dead and monsters lived in Garam, but it turned out that they feed people here. So Jin said nothing. He went out into the field. He stood in the darkness. He counted 122 people now, not 109, 122. There was just enough grain, barely, but there was enough. What if 13 more came tomorrow? What if 20 more came the day after tomorrow? He looked at the field, at the barley standing in neat rows in the moonlight. Then he looked at his hands and realized he needed to plant more, much more, that his 12 rows were just the beginning. And he needed hundreds, thousands. He needed to sow all of Garam. Winter came on the 130th day, so Jin knew it was coming. He had prepared. But Garam's winter turned out to be worse than he'd thought. The temperature dropped sharply, overnight. By morning, the water in the ditches was covered in ice. The barley in the outer beds had turned black from the frost. So Jin went out into the field at dawn and stood before the dead stalks. 3 beds, lost. He clenched his teeth. It was his mistake. He hadn't managed to cover the outer plantings. Not enough hands, not enough time, not enough material. The inner beds had survived. A wall of living trees created a microclimate inside the perimeter, 2 or 3 degrees warmer than outside, warm enough for the barley to survive. But the outer plantings were outside the wall, and the frost killed them overnight. So Jin revised the plan. You can't plant in open ground in winter, but you can build. He began erecting greenhouses, not glass ones, there was no glass, frame greenhouses, made of poles and oiled fabric. The fabric was woven from the fibers of forest plants that Moon-Gill had learned to process. The oil was pressed from pumpkin seeds. The oiled fabric let light through and retained heat. So Jin built the first greenhouse in 4 days. A small one, 3 by 5 meters. Inside, he lit a fire in a stone hearth with a chimney. Warm air flowed through a channel in the floor and heated the ground from below. The principle of an ondol, a Korean heated floor. So Jin smiled when he realized he was building an ondol in a medieval fantasy setting. Professor Kim from the Department of Agricultural Engineering would have appreciated it. The greenhouse was working. The temperature inside stayed at 15 degrees even on the coldest nights. So Jin planted barley and beans in it. And he added a new crop, turnips. Moon-Gill had found wild turnips on the southern slope of the hill. Small, bitter, tough. So Jin took the seeds and planted them in the greenhouse. A week later, the sprouts emerged. Strong. Strong. His hands did their work. By the end of the second week, the turnips were fist-sized, sweet, juicy. Not at all like their wild ancestor. Hua Young tasted one and said she hadn't eaten turnips like this even in the capital. Winter tested them every day. Cold, wind, snow. The firewood was running out faster than they could gather it. So Jin organized the gathering. 3 groups of 10 people. Each group would go into the forest for half a day and return with bundles. Nambi went with each group. She sensed the animals before anyone else and led the people away from danger. Not a single woodcutter died all winter. Nambi lost weight. Winter was hard on her. The fox fur on her ears and tail grew back and became thicker, but her body was freezing. So Jin noticed. He asked Mrs. Yon to sew her a warm jacket from the skins of the very animals Nam Bi had caught herself. Mrs. Yon sewed it. Nam Bi put on the jacket and froze. She touched the fur with her hands. Then she looked at So Jin. She said that no one had ever sewn clothes for her before. So Jin replied that Mrs. Yon had sewn it. Nam Bi shook her head. She said she knew whose idea it was. So Jin turned away. Nam Bi stood there, stroking the jacket. On the 150th day, what So Jin feared most happened. A child fell ill. A 4-year-old boy, the son of one of the refugees, not a fever, worse, a cough, deep, wet, with blood. Hua Yang examined him and said quietly, so the child wouldn't hear, that it was pneumonia. That without proper medicine, there was little hope. So Jin stood and listened. Everything inside him tightened. He left the barracks. He walked out into the field. He knelt down in front of a garden bed in the greenhouse. The earth spoke to him. He asked, not with words, with R1. Is there anything in the forest that can heal the lungs? The earth answered, far away, to the west, where the fog is thickest, a mushroom grows. On the trunks of dead trees, white, with gray veins. The locals call it the breath of the dead, because it grows only on dead wood and smells of rot. But inside, it has a substance that kills the infection in the lungs. So Jin set out in the morning, alone. Yoon Mi asked him not to go. She said the West was dangerous, that it was the territory of something big, something even the earth is afraid to name. So Jin said the child was 4 years old. Yoon Mi fell silent. She let go of his hand. So Jin walked west for 4 hours. The forest grew worse with every step. The trees thicker, darker. The fog thicker. The ground beneath his feet colder. He could feel his field falling behind, how the connection was weakening, how the system was retreating. Here he was not on his own territory. Here he was just a man, weak, slow, with scraped hands and a sore back. He found a mushroom at the 6th hour, white, with gray veins, on the trunk of a dead tree 3 arms widths thick. The mushroom was the size of his head. So Jin reached for it and froze. The earth was screaming, quietly but desperately. It was telling him, don't touch it, don't take it, go away. So Jin looked around. Silence, fog, nothing. He plucked the mushroom, and the forest came alive. The sound came from below, from beneath the earth, as if something enormous had overturned in the depths. The trees around him trembled. The fog thickened into a wall. So Jin shoved the mushroom into his shirt and ran. He didn't see what was behind him. He didn't look back. He just ran. The ground showed him the way back, the shortest one, through windfalls and ravines. He fell. He got up. He ran. Branches lashed his face. Roots clung to his legs. He felt a presence behind him, heavy, ancient, evil. It wasn't chasing him. It was just watching, like a master watches a mouse that stole grain from his table. So Jin ran for 2 hours. When he burst into the clearing in front of the Pekala wall and his feet touched his own ground, the pressure vanished. Instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. He fell to his knees, pressed his hands to the ground. His land, his field. The creature from the depths couldn't reach here. Not yet. Hua Ryong prepared a mushroom decoction in 2 hours, so Jin helped. He explained, grind it up, pour cold water over it, heat it slowly, don't boil it, let it simmer on low heat for an hour. Strain it through a cloth, let it cool. The boy drank 3 spoonfuls. By morning, the cough had quieted down. By evening the next day, the blood had stopped. 3 days later, the child was sitting on his mother's lap, eating porridge. So Jin stood at the door of the barracks and watched. The mother looked up at him. She didn't say a word. She just nodded. So Jin nodded in response and left. Winter dragged on. So Jin built a second greenhouse, a third, a fourth. By the 170 day, he had 6 greenhouses, each with an ondol, each planted. Turnips, barley, beans, peas he'd grown from seeds found by Moon Gill in the ruins of an old monastery garden, wild carrots, small but full of vitamins, onions, garlic. With each new crop, the people's diet improved. So Jin kept a personal watch over this. He remembered from university: scurvy from a lack of vitamin C, beriberi from a lack of thiamine, pellagra from a lack of niacin. Every disease was treated with food, the right food, a varied diet. He could not allow his people to be full, but sick. On the 180th day, 20 more people arrived, from the east, then 17 from the south, then 8, then 30. Rumors were spreading. In the cursed Garam Forest, there is a place where they feed you, where it's warm, where they don't beat you. People came. So Jin took everyone in. Everyone. No questions asked, no strings attached. He sat them down at the table, poured them porridge, gave them a place in the barracks. And the next morning, he went out to the field to plant. More. Even more. His hands knew no rest. They couldn't, because every new mouth meant a new garden bed, and only he could plant each one. Spring exploded, so Jin couldn't find another word for it. The snow melted in 3 days, the ground thawed in a week, and everything he had planted in the fall and preserved sprang up with such force that even the system hummed. The barley stood chest high, the beans bloomed white, the pumpkins spread out in vines like living ropes. The turnips in the greenhouses had grown to the size of a fist and continued to grow. The purification zone had expanded over the winter by 30 meters in all directions. So Jin stood on the tower next to Nam B and looked at the green patch in the middle of the black forest. His spot, small but visible from above, alive in the midst of the dead. The first thing he did in the spring was to expand the wall, a new perimeter, twice as large, 400 meters in diameter. Stakes, clay, stones, his hands, his touch. Everyone worked. 216 people. That's how many there were by spring. So Jin didn't count the days. He counted the mouths. 216 mouths to feed every day, 3 times a day. He planted every inch of space inside the new perimeter, every scrap. And for the first time, he began planning not a week ahead, but for the season. On the 210th day, Li A Ru arrived. She came alone. She emerged from the forest on the eastern side, tall, upright, dressed in men's clothing, with a sword at her belt. Her face was calm and closed off like a door. Nambi whistled from the tower. Han Dol led the men to the wall. So Jin approached the gate. The woman stood before them, looking at the settlement, at the field, at the barracks, at the living wall of wood with leaves at the tops. She was silent. So Jin asked who she was. She replied that her name was Li A Ru, that she was a swordswoman, that Baron Heiran Chonggu had slaughtered her family 20 years ago, that she had fled to Garam because it was the last place on the continent where they weren't looking for her. So Jin asked if she was hungry. Li A Ru looked at him, then at the sword on her belt, then back at him. She said she hadn't eaten in 3 days. So Jin opened the gate and told her there was porridge in the kitchen, 3rd barrack on the left. Li A Ru ate in silence, neatly, carefully. Even when hungry, she ate like a noble woman. She kept her back straight. She held the spoon correctly. She didn't tilt the bowl. So Jin sat across from her and waited for her to finish eating. When she put down her spoon, he asked what else she could do besides wield a sword. Li A Ru looked at him with cold eyes. She said nothing, that she was a weapon, that she'd been trained to kill since she was 6. So Jin nodded. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he didn't need a weapon. There are plenty of people who know how to kill. He needs someone who knows how to protect. Li A Ru frowned. She asked what the difference was. So Jin replied that the difference lies in where you look. When you kill, you look at the enemy. When you protect, you look at those behind you. Li A Ru was silent for a long time. Then she asked what he wanted from her. So Jin said that there were 37 women and girls in Pekel, that beyond the wall, the forest was full of beasts, that someday, people more terrifying than the beasts would appear beyond the wall. that he needed someone who could teach these women and girls to stand tall and hold a sword. Not to kill, to stand tall. Li Aru asked why specifically women. So Jin replied that in this world, women are forbidden by law to carry weapons. That in his village, there is only one law, the one he writes. And that in his village, anyone who wants to defend themselves and others will receive a sword, regardless of what they have between their legs. Li Aru stood up. She squared her shoulders. She looked down at So Jin. She was a head taller than him. She said he was either a saint or a madman. So Jin replied that he was a farmer and that his fields needed protection. Li Aru didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She said she would stay, and that she needed a place for a training ground. A week later, a bell rang on the eastern side of the camp. Li Aru was training the first group. 12 women, of different ages, of different builds. One of them was Mrs. Yan, 52 years old, the same woman who had stood at the door of the children's barracks with an axe on the night of the creature attack. Li Aru handed her a wooden sword and told her to assume a stance. Mrs. Yan stood up, crookedly, uncertainly. Li Aru adjusted her legs, her arms, her back. Mrs. Yan stood there, her knees trembling. Li Aru said it was normal, that everyone's knees tremble, even hers. When somehow, Lady Yan looked at Li Aru doubtfully. Li Aru allowed herself a half smile. The training continued, so Jin watched from a distance. He liked what he saw. Not the sword, not the stances, not the strikes. He liked how the women's faces changed, how the fear faded, how something else appeared. Not aggression, not anger. Dignity. The feeling that you can do it, that you're not a victim, that you have hands, and those hands can hold more than just a bowl and a rag. Li Aru did it without words, without speeches, without motivation. She simply put them in a stance, corrected them, repeated it again, again, again. And the women straightened up, slowly, but inevitably. Nambi was jealous, openly, noisily. She sat on the tower and watched as Li Aru talked with So Jin by the campfire in the evenings. They discussed defense, post locations, patrol routes, dry military matters. But Nambi saw only that So Jin was looking at another woman and listening to her intently. On the third evening, Nambi jumped down from the tower and sat down silently between them. She rested her head on So Jin's shoulder. She wrapped her tail around his arm. Li Aru watched this. She raised an eyebrow. So Jin blushed. He said that it was Nambi and that she didn't like it when he didn't finish, because Nambi growled quietly at Li Aru. Li Aru looked at her calmly, then at So Jin. She said they needed to discuss the southern flank. Tomorrow, when his little dog would be busy. Nambi growled louder. So Jin covered his face with his hands. The caravan appeared on the third day after Yunmi's words. 3 carts, 2 horses for each. The cargo was covered with oiled canvas. A rider rode at the front. A young woman in a traveling dress that had once been expensive and was now expensive but worn. Her hair was gathered under a scarf. Her face was lightly made up, even on the road, even on the way to the cursed forest. She held her back straight and the reins confidently. 2 coachmen rode behind her, middle-aged men with the faces of people who had seen many roads and not a single good one. Nambi whistled from the tower. Han Dole came out to the gate with 4 men. So Jin stood behind them. The rider rode up to the wall. She stopped her horse. She looked at the living stakes sprouting leaves, at the green field beyond the wall, at the barracks, at the tower, at the people watching her from the wall. Then she looked at So Jin. She said her name was Cho Yuna, that she was the leader of a trade caravan from the free city of Namhae, that she had heard that in Garam, someone paid with grain and didn't cheat on the weight, and that she had come to check it out. So Jin looked at her, then at the carts. He asked what she had brought. Yuna listed the items without dismounting. Salt, 10 sacks, cloth, woolen, 2 rolls, rope, 200 meters, needles, 3 sets, clay pottery, 50 pots, and seeds. Yuna took a small bag from her bosom and showed it to him. Rice, wheat, flax. So Jin looked at the little bag of seeds, and his hands reached out on their own. He stopped. He looked at Yuna. He asked what price she wanted. Yuna named her price. So Jin didn't haggle. He said he agreed. Yuna raised an eyebrow. She said he was the first person in 4 years who hadn't haggled. So Jin replied that he wasn't a merchant, he was a farmer, and that the seeds were worth any price. Yuna dismounted. So Jin led her through the village. He showed her the fields, the barn, the mill, the smithy, the greenhouses. Yuna walked in silence, counting. So Jin could see her lips moving. She was counting the sacks in the granary, the number of garden beds, the number of people, the size of the greenhouses. She was a merchant to the core. Every glance was an assessment. Every silence was a calculation. When they reached the mill, she stopped. She looked at the water wheel, at the millstones, at the flow of flour into the sack. Then she turned to So Jin and asked who had built it. So Jin replied that he had. Yuna asked how he knew how to build mills. So Jin replied that he had seen it in a museum. Yuna blinked. She asked again. So Jin repeated, in a museum. Yuna opened her mouth, closed it. Then she laughed, for the first time, briefly but genuinely. That evening, they sat at the table and counted. Yuna laid out her notes. So Jin laid out his. Grain for salt, grain for cloth, grain for seeds. Yuna counted quickly and accurately, in her head, without mistakes. So Jin checked her work. There were no mistakes. She was the best bookkeeper he'd ever seen. He told her so. Yuna looked at him. She was silent. Then she said that being a good bookkeeper wasn't a compliment. So Jin replied that for a farmer, being a good bookkeeper was the highest praise. Yuna smiled. By nightfall, the deal was done. So Jin gave up 30 sacks of barley and 10 sacks of beans. He received salt, cloth, rope, needles, cookware, and most importantly, seeds. He held a small bag of rice and stroked it like a kitten. Moon-Gil stood nearby and shook his head. Yuna watched this, and her expression was strange. Not mocking, not surprised, pensive, as if she had seen something she hadn't expected and couldn't yet put a name to. In the morning, Yuna was ready to leave. The carts were loaded with grain. The drivers were preparing the horses. So Jin came out to the gate. Yuna sat in the saddle and looked down at him. She said she would return in 2 months, that she would bring plows and livestock if he was willing to pay in grain. So Jin said he was willing. Yuna nodded. Then she was silent for a moment. Then she spoke softly. She had been leading caravans for 4 years, alone, without a father, under a false name. Because a woman leading a caravan in Haedong wouldn't survive even a month. So Jin listened. Yuna said that sooner or later, every trading partner found out that she wasn't an assistant, but the owner. And after that, each one either backed out of the deal or tried to take her as a concubine. So Jin stood there and waited. Yuna asked what he would say. So Jin thought for a moment. Then he said it made no difference to him who she was, father, daughter, assistant, mistress. Only one thing mattered to him. The scales didn't lie, and the goods arrived on time. If that was the case, the rest didn't concern him. Yuna looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was strange. So Jin agreed. Yuna left. So Jin watched her go until the caravan disappeared behind the trees. Then he went out to the field. He had rice seeds, real rice. He hadn't grown rice since college, since his junior year, since his internship in Jeollanam-do. Rice required water, lots of water. He needed checkpoints, flooded fields with controlled water levels. So Jin stood in the middle of the field and mapped it out in his head. A dam on the stream, a supply channel, a system of sluices made of planks and clay, a flat area behind the southern wall. Level it, build a levee, flood it, plant it. A month's worth of work, maybe a month and a half. But rice changed everything. Barley fed, rice fed and united. In his world, rice was the foundation of civilization. Not gold, not iron, rice. Because rice required collective labor. One person couldn't grow rice. A community was needed. Water supply, coordination, discipline. Rice built society. So Jin smiled. He clenched the seeds in his fist and went to look for Han Dole. He needed people who knew how to dig straight ditches. Again. That same evening, So Jin sat by the fire and, for the first time in 6 months, felt something resembling peace. Not happiness, not joy. Peace. Heavy and warm, like a blanket. His people were sitting around him, 216 of them. They were eating porridge with turnips and meat. Children were running between the campfires. Moongil was telling the old refugee about the monastery garden. Lady Yan was scolding someone for a dirty bowl. Hua Riang was sorting through herbs. Taegan was sharpening a new knife at the smithy. Lia Ru sat off to the side, sharpening her sword. Nambi lay on the roof of the barracks, gazing at the sky. Yun Mi sat barefoot in the field and prayed. So Jin watched this and thought that 6 months ago, this had been a rotten clearing in a cursed forest. Black earth, dead trees, fog. 112 people in chains, cast out to die. And now there was a village here, with fields, with a mill, with a smithy, with greenhouses, with a living wall, with a women's guard of 12 swords, with a trading partner, with a 3-month supply of grain, and with rice seeds in his pocket. He went his eyes and looked at the black forest beyond the wall. The fog hung as always. Creatures roamed somewhere in its depths. Something ancient and evil slept in Garam's heart. Barren heron ruled beyond the forest's edge. The crown resided in the capital, and none of them knew yet that in the place where they sent people to die, barley grew and the air smelled of fresh bread. The rice vouchers took a month and a half, so Jin dug the water channel himself, every single meter. The soil here was heavier than inside the walls. Clay, stone, roots of dead trees as thick as a thigh. Han Dole led a crew of 20 men out every morning, and they worked until sunset. So Jin demonstrated the slope. He explained why the elevation difference was necessary. Why the sluices? Why the... The men listened and dug. They had long since stopped asking why. They saw that every time the foreman told them to dig here, food would grow from the ground. That was enough. Yuna returned 2 months later, as promised. 5 carts, 2 oxen, 4 plows, a coil of iron wire, and 8 chickens. So Jin stood at the gate and looked at the chickens. Live chickens. He hadn't seen poultry since the day he'd arrived in this world. Yuna dismounted her horse and said that the chickens had cost the most, that the merchant in Namhae had demanded triple the price because he knew there was no livestock in Garam. So Jin picked up a chicken. He examined it. Healthy, well-fed, a good layer. He stroked its feathers, and the chicken clucked in displeasure. Yuna watched this and said it was the first time she'd seen a man stroke a chicken with that kind of expression. So Jin replied that this chicken was worth more than gold, because gold doesn't lay eggs. The chickens changed everything. Not right away. A month later. When the first layer laid an egg, So Jin held it in his palm and felt the system respond. Warmth. Deep. It was his chicken, on his land, fed with his grain. The egg was his harvest. The system counted it. The experiment was underway. Not much, but consistently. Every egg, every day. And the eggs from his farm provided the same buff as the grain. Garam's satiety. Hua Ryung gave an egg to a child with impaired vision. A week later, the boy could see clearly. So Jin wasn't surprised. He was already used to his food having healing properties. He didn't understand how, but he accepted it as a fact, just as he accepted gravity and photosynthesis. It works. Don't ask. He planted the rice in late spring. He flooded the fields with water through the sluices. He planted the seedlings himself. Every single sprout. 320 sprouts, ankle deep in water, bent over. 8 hours straight. His back was on fire. His legs were numb. Moon Gil offered to help. So Jin refused. The rice had to be his. Every single stalk. Otherwise, the system wouldn't count it. When the last sprout went into the water, So Jin straightened up. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat right down in the water, up to his waist. Wet, dirty, happy. Moon Gil stood on the bank of the stream and shook his head. He asked why he was putting himself through such torment. Sojin replied from the water that rice builds civilizations. Moon Gil asked what a civilization was. Sojin thought for a moment. Then he said it was when people are fed, not because they are useful, but because they are human. Moongil was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. On the 270th day, the first meeting took place in Paekol. So Jin had not called it of his own volition. Mrs. Yan came to him that morning and said that the people wanted to speak, that the settlement had grown, that 250 people was not a camp, that rules were needed, who was responsible for what, who gets what, how to divide the harvest, how to punish, how to accept newcomers. So Jin listened and nodded. He knew this day would come, and he feared it, because rules mean power, and power is what he had been running from his entire past life. He had been a compliant employee, a quiet specialist, a man who did his work and went home. And now 250 people were waiting for him to lay down the law. The gathering took place around a large campfire in the evening. So Jin stood before the people and spoke. Quietly, without fanfare. He said there would be one rule: those who work eat. Those who cannot work due to illness or age also eat. Because illness will pass, and old age deserves rest. Those who can work but do not want to eat last. They do not go hungry, but they eat last. Children eat first, always, under any circumstances, even if there is little food. Children first. Then the sick, then the elderly, then the women, then the men, then himself. People listened. A man from among the refugees raised his hand and asked why women came before men. So Jin replied that women give birth to children, and children eat first. The logic closed the circle. The man thought. He sat down. There were no other questions. Then So Jin said a second thing, that there are no slaves in Paekol, no servants, no livestock in human form, that beastmen are residents just like everyone else, that the rune on your wrist doesn't define who you are, that the gray class isn't a death sentence, that here an F-rank farmer is worth just as much as an A-rank swordswoman. Lee A-Ru stood to the side and listened. Her expression didn't change, but she tilted her head slightly. Nambi was sitting on the roof of the barracks, her ears pricked up. She heard every word.
Yunmi stood in the field behind So Jin and prayed. Quietly, as always, So Jin said the third thing, the quietest of all, that anyone who wants to leave can leave, freely, with food for the road, no questions asked, that Paekol isn't a prison, that the fence is there to keep creatures out, not to keep people in. No one stood up. No one left. So Jin nodded. He said that was all, and walked over to the garden. Behind him, 250 people sat in silence. Then they stood up and went about their business. By the 300th day, Paekol had 320 residents. Rumors spread throughout western Haedong. A place in Garam where they feed you, where they don't beat you, where beastmen aren't branded, where women carry swords, where an F-rank farmer rules the village and his grain grows faster than that of the royal mages. People came. Through the fog, through the beasts, through fear. They came in families. They came alone. Old people with nothing to lose walked, and young people with nowhere else to go walked. So Jin welcomed everyone. He fed everyone. He found a place for everyone. And every day he went out to the field and planted. On the 310th day, a monk arrived in Paekol. Not an exile, not a refugee, a monk, in a clean gray robe, with a shaved head, with a staff of white wood. He stood at the gate and smiled. Nambi whistled from the tower. Han Dol came out with the people. The monk bowed and said his name was Zhang He, that he had come on behalf of a man in the capital, that this man would like to know why the runes on the wrists of the people in Garam are changing. So Jin stood at the gate and looked at the monk. His heart beat faster. Runes. He knew. He had seen. He just hadn't spoken of it aloud. Over the past 2 months, the runes had changed for 7 residents of Paekol. Sok Pei was a former thief. His rune had been Weaver. It had become Pathfinder, rank B. So Jin saw it when Sok Pei rolled up his sleeves in the field. The new rune glowed brighter than the old one, more clearly.
Sokpei himself didn't understand what had happened. He thought it was an illness. So Jin looked. He said nothing. Then he spoke with Yun-mi. She placed her fingers on Sokpei's wrist and froze. Then she said that the rune was real, that his class had changed, that the altar of summoning had rewritten his destiny. So Jin asked which altar. Yun-mi replied, the first one, the one underground, the one sleeping beneath Pekel. So Jin asked how she knew. Yun-mi replied that the earth god had told her. And now the monk was standing at the gate, asking about the runes. So Jin invited him inside. He fed him. He sat him down at the table. The monk ate neatly, politely, without greed. Then he looked up and said the porridge was amazing, that it felt warm, that he hadn't felt such warmth even from the royal potions. So Jin replied that it was just ordinary porridge. The monk smiled and said there was nothing ordinary about it. Then he grew serious. He said he was an agent of the crown's secret chancellery, that he had been sent to find out what was happening in Garam, that there was panic in the capital, that the archmages were demanding a military expedition, that Baron Haran was pressuring the change, that runes that change are impossible, that there is only one altar of summoning, and it is in the capital and under the crown's control, and that if there is a second altar in Garam, that changes everything. So Jin listened, silently. His hands lay on the table, calm, but inside, everything tightened. He knew this day would come, that sooner or later the capital would find out, that sooner or later they would come. He asked the monk what would happen. The monk answered honestly, that Baron Haran was preparing an army, that 2 neighboring houses would support him, that the crown was watching for now, but if the runes continued to change, the crown would intervene as well. So Jin asked how much time they had. The monk said 6 months, maybe less. So Jin stood up. He thanked the monk for his honesty. He asked if he would stay the night. The monk looked at him curiously. He said he would stay. So Jin led him to the barracks. Then he went out into the field. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the barley, at the rice, at the pumpkins, at the living tree wall, at the tower where Nam-bi was sitting, at the smithy where Tai-gon was hammering, at the training field where Li-A-Ru was leading 30 swordswomen. 6 months, 6,000 swords. That evening he gathered his inner circle. Yun-mi, Nam-bi, Li-A-Ru, Han Dole, Moon Gil, Lady Yan, Hua Riang, Tai-gon. He told them everything, without holding anything back. The Baron is coming. The army is coming. The crown is watching. The silence was so thick you could hear the fire crackling in the stove. Then Li-A-Ru spoke, quietly, firmly. She said that Hera was her war, that he had slaughtered her family, that she had waited 20 years. So Jin looked at her and said, no, that this was not her war, that this was Baekol's war, and that in Baekol, no one fights alone. Li-A-Ru clenched her teeth, but she remained silent. Han Dole asked how many swords they had. Li-A-Ru answered, 38 women in the guard, 45 men capable of wielding weapons, a total of 83 fighters against 6,000. The silence grew thicker. So Jin said he wasn't going to fight. Everyone looked at him. He said that in 6 months he would sow the fields between Pekel and the Garam border, that each of his fields was territory that beasts could not cross, and that horses could not pass through. Because a field could be turned into a swamp, and a swamp kills cavalry, or rather, any sword. Li-A-Ru raised an eyebrow. Han Dole opened his mouth and closed it. Moon Gil chuckled quietly. So Jin said that wasn't all, that it takes the army 3 days to march from the Garam border to Pekel. 3 days without supplies, because there's nothing to eat in Garam, except for its fields, and that if the army reaches its walls, by that point the soldiers will be hungry, very hungry, and he'll have food, enough for everyone. Lady Yan asked what he planned to do, feed the enemies. So Jin replied, yes. Lady Yan looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was a madman. So Jin replied that madness was hungry people with swords, and well-fed people with swords were just people. Nam-bi, who was sitting on the floor next to his feet, raised her head. She looked up at him. She said that if any of those well-fed people tried to touch him, she would bite his throat out. So Jin stroked her head. She closed her eyes and pressed herself against his knee. The next 6 months were the most tense of Baek Kol's life. So Jin worked like a man possessed. He went beyond the wall and began to sow garam, in strips, from the village to the south, to the east, to the west. Each strip 20 meters wide. Barley, beans, turnips, rice where it could be flooded. He planted from dawn to dusk, every day, no days off. The land cleared behind him like a carpet unfolding before a traveler. The black rot retreated, greenery advanced. By the end of the 3rd month, a strip of clean land stretched 3 kilometers south from Baek Kol. By the end of the 5th, 5 kilometers. So Jin had planted an area the size of a small town, and every square meter of that territory was his field, his weapon. There were fewer creatures. They retreated as the fields expanded. The clean earth burned them. The living trees repelled them. Garam's border was slowly but surely shifting. The black forest was giving way to the green field. So Jin did not celebrate. There was no time to celebrate. He planted. A year after the exile, Baek Kol had 800 residents. 30 households became 50, then 70. Lee A-Ru's women's guard grew to 100 swords. Tae-gon forged weapons day and night. Yuna brought caravans every 6 weeks. 3 carts became 10, then 20. She established a route bypassing the barreny of Haran. Through a mountain pass, a long one, difficult, but safe. So Jin registered Baek Kol as her main client. Yuna now transported goods under the village's name, and that name was already known in 4 provinces. Baron Haran's army entered Garam on the 360th day. 6,000 swords, 2 neighboring houses. The Baron himself at the vanguard, on horseback, in black armor, with the emblem of a bloodied blade on his breastplate. Beside him, a secret observer from the crown, a man without a name, in a gray cloak, who watched and took notes. So Jin learned of this from Nam Bi. She had returned from reconnaissance 2 days before their arrival, wet, dirty, shivering from the cold. She said she had seen a column, a long one, a 3-hour march, cavalry, infantry, supply wagons. So Jin listened. He nodded. He told her to go to sleep. Nam Bi said she wouldn't sleep. So Jin looked at her. She was looking at him. Her yellow eyes were burning. He said, "Okay, don't sleep." The army marched along the road through Garam. The first day went smoothly. A dark forest, fog, dead trees. The soldiers were nervous but kept going. On the second day, they came out into his field. So Jin knew when this would happen. The earth told him. He stood on the tower and looked south, and he saw the moment when the first horseman stopped. A green field lay before them, barley up to their waists, in the cursed forest of Garam, where nothing had grown for 200 years. They stood and watched. Even the horses stopped. The cavalry rode across the field and got stuck. So Jin had prepared this a month ago. 3 strips of particularly deep plowing, loose earth flooded with water from the canals, barley on top, beautiful, even, and beneath it, mud up to the knees. The horses got stuck. The riders dismounted. They cursed. They pulled the horses by the reins. The infantry went around the edge. There, the second strip awaited them, and the third. The 3-day journey turned into 5. The army stretched out. The supply trains fell behind. The soldiers began eating barley from the field. They plucked the ears, chewed the raw grain. So Jin stood on the tower and watched. Yoon Mi stood beside him. He asked if the buff was working on them. Yoon Mi nodded. The soldiers who ate his barley received Garam's satiety, resistance to fear, peaceful sleep. So Jin smirked. He was feeding the army that was marching to kill him. Yoon Mi said he was either a genius or a madman. So Jin replied that one didn't exclude the other. On the 4th day, Yuna did her part. She was behind the army lines, in the rear, with the supply trains, with the Baron's quartermasters who had been bribed 3 months earlier. The salt that Yuna supplied to the villages of the Haran barony passed through these people. They knew her. They trusted her. She met with them at night. In the morning, half the supply wagons took the wrong road. By accident. purely by accident. Kang Shi-yeon appeared in the story at that very moment. So Jin hadn't known about her until that day. Yoon-mi had warned him a week earlier. She said that among the Baron's officers was a person from the crown, a woman, a former investigator. She had been sent to watch over Hera, just as a monk had been sent to watch over Baekal. So Jin asked if she was dangerous. Yoon-mi replied that she was dangerous, but not to them, to the Baron. Kang Shi-yeon entered Baekal through the south gate on the 5th day, alone, dressed in black, with a knife at her belt, a cold face, precise movements. She passed Han Dole's guards like a shadow. Nam-bi whistled from the tower, but it was too late. Shi-yeon was already standing at the door of So Jin's barracks. Yoon-mi came out to meet her. They stood facing each other, the blind priestess and the former investigator. Yoon-mi ran her hand through the air in front of Shi-yeon's face. She paused. Then she said she wasn't an enemy, that she was empty inside, not evil, empty, like a house from which the furniture had been removed. So Jin stepped out. He looked at Shi-yeon. She looked at him. She said she had come to kill him. Then she paused. Then she said she had changed her mind. So Jin asked why. She replied that on her way through his fields, she had eaten his barley. And for the first time in 10 years, she had slept without nightmares, and that she wouldn't kill a man whose grain cures nightmares. So Jin nodded. He offered her dinner. She agreed. Over dinner, Shi-yeon told him everything. 10 years in the secret office, dozens of cases, hundreds of convicts, half of them innocent. She knew. Everyone knew. No one spoke up. She said that 3 years ago she stopped sleeping, that every night she saw the faces of those she had sent to Garam, that she had come here to see where they had died, but she saw where they lived. So Jin listened. He didn't interrupt. When she fell silent, he said one thing, that in Baekal there was work for a person who knew how to find the truth, but the truth here was needed not to punish, but to protect. Shi-yeon was silent for a long time. Then she asked if she could stay. So Jin replied that of course she could, and that the porridge was in the pot, hot. On the 6th day, the Baron's army reached the walls of Baekal. 6,000, tired, hungry, angry. The supply wagons had fallen behind. The horses were exhausted from the mud. The soldiers hadn't slept for 2 days because creatures were howling in the forest. So Jin stood on the wall and watched them. Ranks, spears, banners. Somewhere ahead, Baron Heron Chonggu sat on a raven-black horse. The man who had slaughtered Lee A-ru's family. The man who had been sending the Greys to Garam for 20 years. The man who believed that order was built upon the bones of the weak. So Jin walked across the field toward the army, alone, a shovel on his shoulder, a simple shirt, clean, without armor, without weapons. Behind him, the wall of Baekal, alive, with leaves at the tops. Beyond the wall, 300 of Lee A-ru's swordswomen and 45 of Han Dole's armed men. On the tower, Nam-bi with a drawn bow. By the gunpowder mill, So-ha with sacks of powder. In Yoon's army wagons, with bribed quartermasters. Behind the Baron, among his officers, Kang Shi-yeon under a false name. In the field beyond the gates, Yoon-mi with a bowl of earth in her hands. And 10,000 civilians behind the wall. Women, children, the elderly, men with hoes and shovels, people he had fed for a year. Baron Heiran Jong-gu sat astride his horse at the vanguard. Black armor, a black horse. His face was stern and calm, the face of a man accustomed to victory. He looked down at So Jin from above. One man with a shovel against 6,000 swords. The Baron raised his hand. The army halted. He asked loudly, so the entire formation could hear, who stood before him. So Jin stopped 20 paces away. He thrust his shovel into the ground between himself and the Baron. He answered quietly, but in the silence of the field, his voice carried far. Park So Jin, village headman of Baekal, farmer, rank F. The Baron smirked. He remarked that a rank F farmer had dared to step out to meet him unarmed. He asked if this was bravery or foolishness. So Jin replied that it was neither, that he had come out because he wanted to talk. The Baron said there was nothing to that Baekal was an illegal settlement on crown lands, that its inhabitants were heretics, that the runes that shift were blasphemy, and that he had come to restore order. So Jin listened. He nodded. Then he said one thing. "My Lord Baron, your soldiers haven't eaten properly in 3 days. I've prepared food for everyone. Warm food. Do you seriously think they're going to shoot me now?" Silence. The Baron opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his soldiers. They stood in formation, tired, hungry. Many weren't looking at So Jin, but at the green field around him, at the barley, at the rice, at the pumpkins, at the smell of bread wafting from behind the wall. Because Lady Yan had started baking 2 hours before dawn, on purpose, So Jin had asked her to. The smell of fresh bread is a weapon that doesn't kill. It disarms. The Baron shouted the order. "Form up for the attack. Spears forward." The first rank stepped forward. Nam Bi on the tower drew her bow. Li Aru, behind the wall, placed her hand on her sword. So Ha brought the flint to the fuse. So Jin didn't move. He stood there. He looked at the soldiers, at their faces, young, tanned, peasant faces. He saw these people, not soldiers, people. Boys who'd been drafted into the militia, who'd been plowing fields yesterday and were holding spears today, who'd eaten his barley on the way here and slept without nightmares for the first time in a month. Wagons drove out of the gates of Pakol. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 40. 40 wagons, with bread, with porridge, with meat, with hot herbal tea. Lady Yan sat on the first wagon and guided the horse. Behind her rode the women of Pakol, 20 women, with ladles and bowls. They drove straight into the space between So Jin and the army. They stopped. They began to lay out the food, silently, businesslike, as if this were an ordinary lunch in the field, as if before them were not 6,000 armed men, but 6,000 hungry mouths. To Lady Yan, it made no difference. The Baron was yelling, ordering an attack, to burn the carts, to drive the women away. But the order traveled down the ranks and faded away. The soldiers didn't move. One lowered his spear, then a second, then a third. A young man in the first rank, about 19 years old, tanned, skinny. He stood there watching the woman with the ladle as she scooped porridge into a bowl and held it out to him. To him, the soldier who had come to kill her. She held out the food to him and said, "Sit down, eat, you're hungry." The guy looked at the bowl, then at the Baron, then back at the bowl. He sat down, right on the ground. He put down his spear, he took the bowl, he started eating. The second one sat down after him, the third, the 10th, the 100th, one after another. 6,000 men, slowly, silently. They sat down on the ground and laid down their spears, and ate. Baron Haran sat on his horse and watched as his army sat down in the mud and ate porridge. His face was white. His hand gripped the reins so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was an A-rank blood knight. He could kill So Jin with a single blow. He could slaughter half of these women with their carts. He could. But his army was eating. And he understood that if he drew his sword now against the man who had just fed his soldiers, by evening he would have no army. So Jin approached him, close, within arm's reach. He looked up at him. The Baron looked down at him. So Jin spoke quietly. "My Lord Baron, I have tilled this land for 2 years. If you trample it, I will survive. If you trample the people behind me, I will suffer more. But before we begin, I have one request. Dismount, sit down, and eat. You're hungry too, I can see it." The Baron looked at him. For a long time, his eyes were dark, evil. But deep within those eyes, So Jin saw something else. Not fear, not hatred, confusion. Baron Haran Chong had lived for 41 years in a world where the strong take and the weak give, where food is a weapon, where feeding the enemy is madness. And now, standing before him, was a man who had fed his army, who had come out to face 6,000 swords with a shovel and bread, who looked up at him without fear and without hatred, just looked. The Baron dismounted, slowly, with difficulty. He took off his helmet. Beneath the helmet was the face of an ordinary, weary man with gray at his temples. He sat down on the ground. So Jin himself poured him a bowl of porridge, set it before him. The Baron looked at the bowl, then at So Jin. Then he took it and began to eat. The first spoonful, the second, the third. His shoulders slumped. His jaw relaxed. The buff had taken effect. Garam's satiety, resistance to fear, peaceful sleep. The Baron finished eating. He set the bowl on the ground. He looked up. He spoke quietly so that only So Jin could hear. "How do you do it?" So Jin crouched down beside him. He replied, "I plant the seed, I water it, I wait, I harvest. Nothing more." The Baron shook his head. He said that wasn't an answer. So Jin replied that he had no other. At that moment, Yoon Mi emerged from behind the wall. She was walking barefoot across the field. In her hands, a bowl of earth. Black hair blowing in the wind, eyes closed. A slender figure in a white robe. She walked straight toward the center of the field, toward the spot where the farmer and the Baron sat facing each other. And when she raised the bowl above her head, the earth beneath Peckle trembled. Deeply, gently, like a heartbeat. And the runes on people's wrists began to glow. On everyone, on both sides, on the residents of Peckle, on the soldiers, on the Baron, on So Jin himself. A golden light shone from beneath their skin, warm, alive. The first altar of summoning, which had been sleeping for 200 years beneath the earth of Peckle, had fully awakened. So Jin looked at his wrist. The rune was changing. The letters were flowing. The old inscription was disappearing. Farmer, rank F, no application. It was fading. New words were appearing in its place, slowly, like ink soaking into the skin. Sower of the altar, rank S+, and one line below, he who died to feed strangers, summoned to feed his own. A year had passed since that day. So Jin sat at the edge of a rice field, barefoot, in a work shirt. A shovel lay nearby. That very one. The one he had stuck into the ground in front of Barren Haran. Since then, he hadn't let it out of his hands. Not because it was special, because he was used to it. A shovel is a tool, and a tool must be kept close at hand. A lot had changed over the past year. Barren Haran hadn't returned to his barony, not right away. He stayed in Peckle for 3 days, then a week, then a month. So Jin didn't hold him back, didn't try to talk him out of it. He just fed him, every day. Porridge, bread, meat, vegetables. In the second week, the Baron took off his armor. In the third, he began walking through the fields. In silence, he watched the barley grow, the women training with swords, the children running between the barracks, the beastmen working alongside humans, and no one staring at their ears and tails. In the fourth week, he came to So Jin in the evening and sat across from him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that his father had been the first to sign the decree exiling the Greys to Garam, that he had grown up on that decree, that his whole life he had believed the Grey classes were trash that needed to be disposed of, that he had done this for 20 years, and that 3 weeks in Peckle had shattered that belief. Not with words, not with arguments, with food. Simple hot food that a man with an S+ rune on his wrist poured into his bowl every morning. A man who could have killed him, could have driven him away, could have humiliated him. And instead, he poured porridge. So Jin listened. Then he said he understood, that hatred is hunger, that a full man hates less often. The Baron looked at him, asked what he should do next. So Jin replied that he didn't know, that he was a farmer, that strategy and politics weren't his business. The Baron smiled. For the first time, he said that a farmer who had disarmed 6,000 swords with a bowl of porridge had no right to say that politics wasn't his business. So Jin blushed and said nothing. The Baron left a month later. He returned to his barony. He revoked the 3 decrees of exile. He lowered taxes on the peasants. He opened the border with Garam for trade. That didn't make him a saint. He remained the same man. Tough, calculating, dangerous. But now there was a sack of barley from Peckle on his table, and every morning his cook made porridge from it. The crown responded 3 months after the army returned without a victory. King Haedong sent a letter to So Jin, an official one, with a seal, with a gold cord. So Jin read it. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Yun Mi and said he had no idea how to reply to kings, that he hadn't even finished school properly. Yun Mi smiled and said the reply had to be honest, so Jin sat down and wrote. Simply, without titles, no formalities. He wrote that he was grateful for the letter, that Paekol was ready to trade with the crown, that there was enough grain, that if the king wanted to see Garam, he should come, in person. So Jin would show him the fields, and feed him. Shi Young read the letter and said it was either diplomatic genius or suicide. So Jin replied that he had simply written the truth. Shi Young shook her head and sent the letter. The reply arrived 2 months later. The king did not come, but he sent an ambassador with 3 chests of gold and an offer of a vassal oath. So Jin stood before the ambassador. 3 chests of gold on the ground, scrolls on the table. The ambassador in silk robes. So Jin in a work shirt with dirt under his fingernails. The ambassador read out the terms. Paekol becomes a vassal domain of the crown. So Jin receives the title of Barren. The lands of Garam are officially granted to him. In return, an annual tribute of grain and recognition of royal authority. So Jin listened. Then he turned to Yuna and said, "Listen, at our company parties, the accountant usually handled this. Yuna, please come here. There are people with gold here." Yuna negotiated for 3 days. Tough. Exactly. Without a single concession that wasn't paid for. The result? Paekol retained full autonomy, no tribute, a trade agreement between equals. So Jin remained the village head, not a baron, village head. He rejected the title. The lands of Garam remained unclaimed, because the land does not belong to people. People belong to the land. The ambassador left, stunned, with a single chest of gold that Yuna returned as a gesture of goodwill. The other 2 remained. Yuna invested them in glass for greenhouses and seeds from the southern provinces. The runes continued to change. Every month, a new mark would appear on one of the residents of Paekol. The former widow of the cook became an S-rank herbalist. An orphaned boy received the A-rank architect class. Taegon, a young Moor, became an S-rank forge master. The first altar beneath Paekol was at work. It read people, not blood, not lineage, not money. Talent. True talent. And it gave each person what they deserved. So Jin watched this and thought about the old altar in the capital, about how the aristocracy had destroyed the first altar 200 years ago and replaced it with one that assigned classes based on blood, about how every child in Haedong received their rune not based on talent, but on birth. A baron's son became a knight, a peasant's son became a peasant. The system, eternal, impenetrable, unjust. And now, beneath his feet, lay the altar that had shattered that system, that had returned to the people what had been stolen from them. By its 3rd year, Paekol was a city, not a village, a city. 12,000 residents, 7 satellite villages, each with its own field and wall. Li Ru's women's guard, 300 swords strong. Taegon's smithy, supplying tools to all of Garam. Yuna's trade network, spanning 4 provinces. Soha's laboratory, producing cures for diseases that the capital's doctors deemed incurable. The temple of Yun Mi, where a blind priestess taught young girls to listen to the earth. Shi Yan's intelligence network, which knew what was happening in every barony of western Haedong. And the fields, endless fields, green, alive, from the walls of Paekol to the horizon. Barley, rice, wheat, flax, vegetables, fruits, grapes that So Jin personally grafted onto a wild vine from Garam. Fish ponds, pastures, a million sacks of grain in barns that didn't rot or mold because every barn was a living structure. The city walls were made of living wood, thick, entwined with grapevines and ivy, with towers where flowers grew. So Jin planted every flower himself, because the system required his hands, and because he liked it. He stood on the wall and looked at the city that had grown from a single drainage ditch, and he remembered how 2 years ago he had sat in the mud with a stone in his hand and dug his first ditch. 12 grains of barley, 9 people who dug with him, and a creature in the fog that couldn't cross the line. So Jin stood before the first altar, underground, in a cave, deep beneath the central square of Pekol. Yun-mi had found the entrance 3 months ago, a crack in the rock beneath the foundation of the old temple, a narrow passage, a staircase of stones worn smooth by thousands of feet. Down, deep down, 200 steps, and there, in a cave the size of a cathedral, the altar. It was enormous, a stone slab in the center, smooth, white, without a single crack. A pattern ran across the floor around it. Runes, hundreds of runes, thousands. They glowed with a warm, golden light, the very same light that flared up when Yun-mi raised the chalice. The altar was breathing, so Jin could feel it with his palms. He placed his hands on the stone, and the stone responded, like the earth, like his field, only deeper, more powerful, more ancient. Yun-mi stood beside him. She told him the story, piece by piece, bit by bit, over 3 months. The god of the earth told her, and she told So Jin. 200 years ago, this altar stood on the surface, open, free. Every child of Haedong came to it at the age of 15 and received a class based on talent, not on blood, on what they could do and loved. A peasant's son could become an archmage. A baron's daughter could become a weaver. The altar knew no classes. It knew only the truth. The aristocracy would not tolerate this. They assembled an army. They came here. They destroyed the order of priestesses that guarded the altar. That very order of Jivan, the order of Yun-mi. They cursed the land around it. They flooded it with poison and darkness. They turned the blooming valley into the black forest of Garam. And they built a new altar in the capital, their own, under their control, one that assigned classes based on blood, on money, on command. And for 200 years, every child in Haedong received not their true class, but the one assigned to them by the system. A system created by people, not gods, people. So Jin listened to this story, his hands clenching the edge of the altar. He thought of Moongil, who had been a weaver for 30 years, even though his true talent was as a gardener. Of Taegon, who had been a hammerer for 22 years, even though his true class was master blacksmith. Of every child in Haedong who came to the false altar and received a false rune, and went on to live a false life. 200 years, millions of people, millions of stolen destinies. So Jin told Yun-mi that he wanted to fully awaken the altar, not for Baekol, for everyone, for every child in Haedong. Yun-mi nodded. She knew he would say that. She had been waiting. So Jin asked what was needed. Yun-mi replied, Earth, living earth, lots of living earth. The altar feeds on the field of life. The more life there is around it, the stronger it becomes. When its field of life encompasses all of Garam, the altar will awaken at full power, and its signal will reach the capital. Every child with a false rune, and the runes will begin to change. Everywhere. For everyone. So Jin left the cave. He walked through the city. He went outside the wall. He stood at the edge of his field. He looked at the black forest that began 5 kilometers from the wall. Between him and the forest lay green fields, his fields. But beyond lay darkness, a lot of darkness. Garam was enormous. Dozens of kilometers of dead forest, thousands of hectares of cursed land. He had to sow it all, every meter, personally. He remembered his death. A truck with seedlings. A truck. Darkness. He remembered that he wasn't actually carrying seedlings. Seeds. Contraband seeds of a rare rice variety that the corporation wanted to destroy. Too high yielding. It would have crashed prices. The corporation ordered him to dispose of the shipment. He didn't dispose of them. He was taking them to a farmer he knew from the internet, who promised to plant and distribute them. So Jin died on the road with the seeds in the back of his truck. He died so that someone else could have food. The altar heard exactly that. Not an agronomist, not a specialist, not a corporate employee, a man who died for someone else's seeds, and summoned him here, to a world where farmers are trash, where the land is cursed, where children are dealt false fates, summoned him to do what he knew how to do, to plant, to grow, to feed. So Jin smiled. He took a shovel and went into the forest to plant. 3 more months passed. So Jin went into the forest every day, alone, with a bag of seeds and a shovel. He dug, he planted. He returned at night, dirty, barely alive. He lay down, fell asleep, woke up, went again. The green strip grew, meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer. The earth awoke beneath his hands. The darkness receded. The fog thinned. Trees that had been dead for 200 years sprouted green shoots. Nambi walked with him, every day, silently. She carried the bags. She guarded him. She brought water. She didn't ask why. She knew. She always knew. During breaks, she would sit down next to him and rest her head on his knee. So Jin would stroke her hair between her ears. She would close her eyes and purr, quietly, like a motor. So Jin smiled. Liaru set up posts along the route, a watchtower every 500 meters. The women's guard patrolled the border day and night. Liaru came to him one evening, silently. She laid her family's sword at his feet. So Jin looked at the sword, then at her. She said, "Take it. I no longer serve them. I serve the field." So Jin took the sword. He placed it on a shelf in his house, next to the shovel. Soha worked in the lab 20 hours a day. She created a fertilizer, from bone meal and ash and whatever else she found deep inside the altar cave. The fertilizer accelerated growth tenfold. So Jin sowed a strip with the fertilizer, and within a week the barley was chest-high. Soha came to him with the results. Her eyes burned behind her round glasses. Her ears were red. She spoke quickly. She got tangled up. She jumped from thought to thought. So Jin listened and nodded. Then he said she was a genius. Soha fell silent. She blushed to the roots of her hair. She mumbled that she was just a chemist. So Jin replied that it was one and the same. Yuna expanded her trading network. She no longer traveled herself. She had 30 caravans, 200 carts. Pekel's grain went to 6 provinces. Salt came back, and glass, and fabric, and books. Yuna brought books, a whole cartload. Moongil cried when he saw them, so Jin almost cried too, but he held it in. Yuna stayed overnight once to discuss logistics, and she didn't leave. She never left again. Her caravans traveled without her, and she sat at the table in Sojin's house and counted, and smiled, and drank tea made from his herbs, and sometimes looked at him in a way that made Sojin blush and look away. Shiyan silently did her work, every day, without a day off. She knew everything, who steals, who lies, who is plotting. But she didn't come to Sojin with accusations, with solutions. This man steals because he's afraid he won't have enough. Give him more work, and he'll stop. This person lies because he's ashamed of his past. Talk to him. Sojin listened and acted. Shiyan left, silently. But sometimes, when he was feeling down, she would come in the evening and sit down next to him without a word. She didn't say a single word. She was just there, and that was enough. On the last day of the 3rd year, Sojin stood on the wall of Bekol and looked at Garam. Greenery covered everything, from the walls to the horizon. Not a single dead tree in sight, not a single patch of black earth. The fog had lifted. The sky was blue, clear, high. The sky over Garam hadn't been like this in 200 years. Behind him, the city bustled. 12,000 people. Children ran through the streets. Women carried baskets of vegetables. Men hammered away at the construction site of the new neighborhood. Taigan was forging in the smithy. Liaru was drilling recruits on the parade ground. Soha was setting off explosions in the lab. Yuna was arguing with a caravan driver over the weight. Lady Yan was in charge of the kitchen. Moongil was reading a book to the children. Han Dol was sharpening a sword by the gate. Hua Ryung was sorting through herbs. Sok Bei was carrying a sack of grain to the mill. Nam B was sleeping on the roof of the tower, curled up in a ball in the sun. And somewhere far away, in the capital of Haedong, in the throne room, the young king looked at his wrist, at the rune that had begun to glow, that had begun to change, because the first altar had awakened, because an F-rank farmer had sown the cursed forest from the wall to the horizon, because the earth had come alive. And now every child in Haedong will discover their true class. So Jin stood on the wall and watched the sunset. Yunmi approached him. She took his hand. Nambi woke up in the tower and yawned. Li Eru stood by the gate. So Ha came out of the lab, wiping her glasses. Yuna climbed onto the wall with a cup of tea. Shi Yun emerged from the shadows, quietly, as always. So Jin looked at them, at the 6 women standing next to him, at the city behind him, at the fields before his eyes. He did not become king. He did not take the throne. He did not accept the title. He remained the village headman of Baikol. It just so happened that his village had 12,000 people and 1,000,000 sacks of grain and walls of living wood entwined with vines. Yunmi asked quietly what he was thinking about. So Jin was silent for a moment. Then he said they needed to check the southern fields tomorrow, that the rice would soon be ready for harvest, that they had to get up early in the morning. Yunmi smiled. She squeezed his hand. So Jin looked at the sunset. Golden light lay on the green fields. A warm breeze rippled through the rice like waves. The city behind them hummed quietly and steadily, as if alive. He closed his eyes. He inhaled. The air smelled of earth, of grain, bread, life. He exhaled, opened his eyes, and walked down from the wall, toward the field, to check the beds, because in the morning they would have to plant. They would always have to plant.